18. Henry David Thoreau. Born July 12, 1817, died May 6, 1862. There are several reasons for suspecting Thoreau to have been a case of cosmic consciousness, such as his addiction to solitude, his love of mysticism and the mystics, the almost preternatural acuteness of his senses, his love for and fellowship with animals, his intellectual keenness and his moral elevation. The present editor has, however, searched in vain for data which might convert this presumption into anything like a certainty, and Thoreau is so close to us that, had he experienced illumination, the evidence thereof ought to be forthcoming and decisive. But what do these 8 lines mean, if not that their author had passed through some such experience as is here treated of? 2. I hearing get who had but ears, 275. And sight who had but eyes before. I moments live who lived but years. And truth discern who knew but learning's lore. I hear beyond the range of sound, 276. I see beyond the range of sight, 277. New earths, and skies, and seas around. And in my day the sun doth pale his light. If Thoreau experienced illumination at the usual age, evidence of the fact should be found in Walden, which was written between 1845 and 1854, when its author was 28 to 37 years of age. As a matter of fact, we do find passages in that book which suggest that the writer of it, if not an actual case of cosmic consciousness, was yet well on the way thereto. For instance, our manners have been corrupted by communication with the saints. Our hymn books resound with a melodious cursing of God and enduring him forever. One would say that even the prophets and redeemers had rather consoled the fears than confirmed the hopes of man. There is nowhere recorded a simple and irrepressible satisfaction with the gift of life, any memorable praise of God, 199a, 85. 278. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion, only 1 in 100 millions for a poetic or divine life, 199a, 97. 279. Sometimes, when I compare myself with other men, it seems as if I were more favored by the gods than they, beyond any deserts that I am conscious of. As if I had a warrant and surety at their hands which my fellows have not, and were especially guided and guarded. I do not flatter myself, but if it be possible they flatter me. I have never felt lonesome, or in the least oppressed by a sense of solitude, but once, and that was a few weeks after I came to the woods, when, for an hour, I doubted if the near neighborhood of man was not essential to a serene and healthy life. To be alone was something unpleasant. But I was at the same time conscious of a slight insanity in my mood and seemed to foresee my recovery. In the midst of a gentle rain, while these thoughts prevailed, I was suddenly sensible of such sweet and beneficent society in nature, in the very pattering of the drops, and in every sound and sight around my house. An infinite and unaccountable friendliness all at once, like an atmosphere, sustaining me, as made the fancied advantages of human neighborhood insignificant, and I have never thought of them since. Every little pine needle expanded and swelled with sympathy and befriended me. I was so distinctly made aware of the presence of something kindred to me, even in the scenes which we are accustomed to call wild and dreary, and also that the nearest of blood to me and humanest was not a person nor a villager, that I thought no place could ever be strange to me again. Some of my pleasantest hours were during the long rain storms in the spring and fall, which confined me to the house for the afternoon as well as the forenoon, soothed by their ceaseless roar and pelting. When an early twilight ushered in a long evening, in which many thoughts had time to take root and unfold themselves. In those driving northeast rains, which tried the village houses so, when the maids stood ready with mop and pail in front entries to keep the deluge out, I sat behind my door in my little house, which was all entry, and thoroughly enjoyed its protection. In one heavy thunder shower the lightning struck a large pitch pine across the pond, making a very conspicuous and perfectly regular spiral groove from top to bottom, an inch or more deep and 4 or 5 inches wide. As you would groove a walking stick. I passed it again the other day and was struck with awe on looking up and beholding that mark, how more distinct than ever, where a terrific and resistless bolt came down out of the harmless sky 8 years ago. Men frequently say to me, "I should think you would feel lonesome down there and want to be nearer to folks, rainy and snowy days, and nights especially." I am tempted to reply to such, "This whole earth, which we inhabit, is but a point in space. How far apart, think you, dwell the two most distant inhabitants of yonder star, the breadth of whose disk cannot be appreciated by our instruments? Why should I feel lonely? Is not our planet in the Milky Way? This which you put seems to me not to be the most important question. What sort of space is that which separates a man from his fellows and makes him solitary? I have found that no exertion of the legs can bring two minds much nearer to one another. What do we want most to dwell near to? Not to many men, surely, the depot, the post office, the barroom, the meeting house, the schoolhouse, the grocery, Beacon Hill, or the 5 Points, where men most congregate, but to the perennial source of our life. Whence in all our experience we have found that to issue, as the willow stands near the water and sends out its roots in that direction. This will vary with different natures, but this is the place where a wise man will dig his cellar. I one evening overtook one of my townsmen, who has accumulated what is called a handsome property, though I never got a fair view of it, on the Walden Road driving a pair of cattle to market. Who inquired of me how I could bring my mind to give up so many of the comforts of life. I answered that I was very sure I liked it passably well, I was not joking. And so I went home to my bed and left him to pick his way through the darkness and the mud to Brighton, or Brighttown, which place he would reach some time in the morning. Any prospect of awakening or coming to life to a dead man makes indifferent all times and places. The place where that may occur is always the same, and indescribably pleasant to all our senses. For the most part we allow only outlying and transient circumstances to make our occasions. They are, in fact, the cause of our distraction. Nearest to all things is that power which fashions their being. Next to us the grandest laws are continually being executed. Next to us is, not the workman whom we have hired, with whom we love so well to talk, but the workman whose work we are, 199a, 143-5. I only know myself as a human entity. 280 the scene, so to speak, of thoughts and affections, and am sensible of a certain doubleness by which I can stand as remote from myself as from another. However intense my experience, I am conscious of the presence and criticism of a part of me, which, as it were, is not a part of me, but spectator, sharing no experience, but taking note of it, and that is no more I than it is you, 199a, 146. 19, J. B. Born 1821. Entered Cosmic Consciousness 1859, AET. 39 years. Was a Methodist and in high standing in his church. He prayed fervently for light, for assurance of salvation, etc. Seemed no use, so he ceased praying, then light broke gradually, no subjective light, but a steady, continuous intellectual illumination, and with it a deeper and deeper feeling of moral peace, rest and happiness. This intellectual illumination and moral peace steadily grew until the whole man was transformed. He became an acknowledged authority among enlightened and able men on all spiritual matters. Consciousness of immortality came shortly after intellectual and moral new birth. It really came with the others, but took longer to attain to its full growth. He had had the hope of immortality all along, in common with other members of his church, but never the thing itself or anything approaching it. Now, that is, since illumination, he does not look forward to immortality, but is conscious that he has attained to it, entered into possession and enjoyment of it. He was born in England, was a weaver, in America has for years been an undertaker. Is, from the point of view of the schools, entirely uneducated. The present writer passed several hours in his company, about 1890, and was impressed by his intellectual enlightenment, but far more by his perfect happiness, his absolute moral peace. An informant, himself an able and thoughtful man, a dweller in a great capital, who all his life has seen, heard and read the best men and books, and who for years has been an earnest seeker for the truth, saw J. B. first in 1870 and has been intimate with him ever since. He says, "I had not heard him talk 10 minutes before I knew that I was now for the first time in the presence of a man who had what I wanted. I have never met a man who was so mighty in the scriptures. He knew the Bible almost by heart and had the same inspiration as Paul and John. There never was a time when I met J.B. that he did not by a word, a sentence, or a long talk, make it clear that he stood on a rock of solid truth." XXCP. Born 1822. Has been all his life a laboring man. Was, and is, esteemed as a saint and sage by every man who knew and knows him. His conversation is enlightened to an extraordinary degree. Is, of course, uneducated. Attained to cosmic consciousness in the year 1859, when he was in his 37th year. An informant, who knew C.P. well, says, he has been a great dreamer of curious and remarkable dreams. His chief charm is his wonderful exposition of the scriptures. He is the very embodiment of the living Christ. He despises money. One feels in his presence that here is a brother. His letters are the most charming I have ever received. The most curious and strange thing in his case is that he believes that death ends all. He has been a fine public speaker for 40 years. First in the Methodist Church, then for a time in a semi-infidel vein, but since his enlightenment his talks have been mostly biblical. He has strong socialistic views. The writer of the present volume has had 2 long talks with C.P. and can testify to his extraordinary intelligence. His want of faith in the continuance of the individual life seems at first sight to set him apart from the class of men having cosmic consciousness. But, first, as before noted, we must make great allowance for range of spiritual life on that plane, and, second, it must be noted that his conviction was, probably, to him, more optimistic than would have been that of the usual eternal life. He believes, is indeed sure, that after death he will be absorbed into God, and that in losing his individuality he will gain something much more valuable. His feeling, his conviction, his knowledge, as in all these cases, is that the best will happen. He gives a slightly different interpretation to this best, that is all. In July, 1895, C.P. published a book, in which he endeavored to set forth some of the spiritual results of illumination in his case. Such a task is no light one, as many besides C.P. have found. It is, in fact, in all cases really an impossible task, as Paul, Whitman and others have testified. C.P. was less qualified than have been some other men of the class for the enterprise, and his attempt, though exceedingly interesting, cannot be pronounced a perfect success. The following quoted passages will show, however, to whoever can understand them, that C.P. beyond all doubt, belongs to the order of men treated of in this volume, a fact which was positively known to the present writer long before the book quoted was written. C.P. says, 281 Paul said, "The Jews missed the kingdom of heaven because they sought it by the deeds of the law of Moses, by the righteousness of the moral law, instead of seeking it through righteousness of faith, in the perfection of the order of existence, the faith of the Christ." They could not see that there are 2 separate and distinct kinds of righteousness, or laws, one imperfect, for the imperfect or carnal mind, and the other perfect, for the perfect or spiritual mind. Which 2 states are as separate and distinct from each other as sheep are from goats. 132:13. The life is not in believing there is a divinity somewhere, but in knowing it. 282 To know the word of the truth, and to have its spirit generated in the mind and heart, is to have its pure offspring, its son, begotten within, consciously crying, Father, with certitude. 132:19. The government of the carnal mind, which hath not the Son of divinity begotten in it, hath no actual knowledge of what the only true divinity is. 283 No one knoweth the names of the actual divinity and its Lamb until these are written in their understandings by special revelation to each one individually. On this rock of the actual revelation of the Christ in the mind by its eternal Father the congregation of the true Christ is built. This is the sole immovable basis of certitude. And the world may continue to divide indefinitely into disagreeing sects until it receives this revelation, because it can have no certitude until then, but all who receive it see eye to eye, and they cannot disagree. 132:20. 284 It was of this very part, this Son begotten in him, which was the spiritual mind, that the Spirit of truth said, Thou art my Son, this day have I begotten thee. And he knew the very day he was begotten, the very day he became conscious of being made alive to this Father of his understanding, because this spiritual Son in him spontaneously cried Father with natural certitude as it had not cried before. And thus this begotten Son of the eternal Spirit of truth so cries in every one in whom it is begotten, so that they, and they only, know how the firstborn was begotten. And these only know what the dominion of the divinity is, for, except a man be thus born again he cannot see it. 132:22. The carnal mind 285 can talk about the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, but it realizes nothing of either, because this Son of God is not begotten in it. 132:23. Moreover, he said, at that day, 286, the day when they should be conscious of this Spirit's having come to them, ye shall know that I am in the Father, and ye in me, and I in you. And as it was impossible for the man to be personally in them, and they in him, it is clear that when the Spirit of truth had written itself clearly in their consciousness this would be both the Father and the Son in them, and they in that. And the work was purely that of a spiritual mental state. 132:24. He that was least in the kingdom of heaven was greater than John. 287 Because those who entered into that were made perfect by the fullness of light of the eternal Spirit. Hence, the law of the prophets were until John, but with him began the preaching of the kingdom of God. 132:31. And to these, the enlightened, it is entirely clear that this divinity, 288 being eternal, all existence must be eternal, because all truth is simply the truth of existence. To these existence is one eternal immensity of infinite existence, acting with infinite force, in an inevitable, infinite, therefore absolutely perfect order, in whose perfection, or truth, all things and their action must of necessity be included. And this Paul expressed in the one comprehensive, basic sentence, all things are of the divinity. 132:68. The apostles were ministers of the new covenant. 289 which was based on this rock, which was an entirely new basis of ratiocination, and they were not ministers of the old covenant of the moral law at all. The moral law, being the knowledge of good and evil, is the ministration of death, while the new law is the ministration of life. The old is the minister of condemnation, which is the death, and the new is the minister of justification, which is the life. Hence those who pass into the dominion of the new necessarily pass out of the dominion of the old. And thus they must be made free from the old, and it is thus that there is no condemnation, no death, to those who are in the covenant of the Christ. 132:73. This 290 reveals the boundless radiance of the infinite face of the real divinity, beaming on him who sees it its equipoise of mercy and truth. 132:75. And when this Christ 291 is formed in the mind and heart it is known to be the Spirit of faith, in the infinite order of all existence as all true, and for this reason it resisteth not the evil, which is an inevitable part of the order. And seen in the light of the whole truth to be all good, having a perfect use. 132:140. 292 And it is thus that this Spirit of faith in the whole order is the Christ formed in the mind, and this is the Lamb of God which taketh away all sin, by taking away all resistance of the natural order of existence. When this Christ is formed in the mind then it has the perfect light by which all the things of the divinity of all truth are clearly understood. Then, and only then, it knoweth how all the things of the new covenant are spiritually discerned, for then, and only then, it knoweth the only true divinity and its Christ. And then the mind knoweth with entire certitude, by its own experience, that all that the firstborn, Paul, or any of the believers, had of the knowledge of the truth, and they had its fullness, came to them by internal revelation. And not by any external signs and wonders. 132:140-1. By being perfectly enlightened by the spirit of all existence he was reconciled to it all, therefore could not resist any part of it as if it had no right to be. And he cheerily saw that the way to the peace and harmony of mankind with each other was through the reconciliation to, or harmony with, the infinite order, which he saw to be all truth, therefore infinite perfection. 132:247. XXI. The case of H.B. in his own words. My early home was one of quite narrow limitations. I did not find myself among books, though such was my desire for them that nothing else had any attractions for me. My mental activity must have been noticeable, as I can now see it, in comparison with that of others about me. I never found much pleasure in the ordinary amusements of boyhood. I preferred to be alone, and in summer I loved most of all to be in the woods. I found companionship in the trees, they seemed nearer to me than human beings. I used to talk to them, and think they said something to me. All my life the woods have thus drawn me to themselves, and now, if I could, I would live among the trees. All my life I have loved to be alone and still do. Whether, according to Byron's dictum, I am a wild beast or a god, I will not stop to guess. It is also true that I love the society of congenial spirits in domestic and general life. I soon learned that men regulated their intercourse with each other by conventional rules and not by what I now understand as spiritual laws, but which I could not then name and could not understand, though I felt their presence. As Wordsworth felt an outward presence, in nature. The shocks that my spiritual consciousness experienced as I came in contact with rough men were such as no language can reach. There has been a gradual development of this perception, or spiritual vision, all through life. I early began to inquire how things came to be as they are, and that is what I am now trying to do. As things look to me now, I must always regard it as a misfortune that I was born into the atmosphere of the Calvinistic theology. I lived for a score of years under the shadow of that black cloud, years which might have otherwise been spent in healthy growth. This theology I tried to accept intellectually because everybody about me did, but my soul never endorsed it. At the age of 40 I was quite free from the dwarfing influence of such a line of thought, and since then have breathed freely. What I am I owe mostly to books. I have been but little in contact with men who could have taught me and given me strength. A year or two at an academy and 20 weeks in college is all I have known in those directions. As I came out from the shadow of that dark theology I chanced to hear Emerson. I then got his books. I have been a close student of them for 50 years. I owe more to him than to, I almost might say, all other men beside. Next I found my way to Darwin. Mine was the only copy of the Origin of Species to be found in my community for 10 years. The first real mental illumination I remember to have experienced was when I saw that the universe exists in each of its individual atoms, that is, the universe is the result of a few simple processes infinitely repeated. When a drop of water has been mathematically measured, every principle will have been used which would be called for in the measurement of the heavens. All life on the globe is sustained by digestion and assimilation. When by voluntary and traumatic action these stop, death follows. The history of an individual mind is the history of the race. Know one thing in its properties and relations and you will know all things. All crystallography is in one grain of sand, all animal life in one insect, all vegetable in a single bud. I was then about 40. My next was when I saw there was no boundary line between vegetable and animal life, and hence no beginning nor end to either. The first of these experiences came to me long before I found what Thales said on this point. These statements are perhaps enough to indicate the direction in which my intellect has developed. Whatever calm delights have come to me through the intellect, the true grandeur of my days has been found in the atmosphere of the moral sentiment, a grandeur which reduces all material happenings to the value of toys. I felt this when a boy as an overshadowing presence that was constantly drawing me away from all that seemed to make up the life of those about me, drawing me away I knew not how or whither. What I then saw dimly, or as, through a glass darkly, now shines all about me with a brightness exceeding that of the sun. In its light I see that love and justice cannot be limited by what, in the poverty of our ignorance, we call time and space. Hence all the thinking and all the teaching that has been done in the world, founded in our ideas of time and space, are blown away like chaff, or are consumed like wood, hay, and stubble. I was nearly 60 when I came to see that what is true at any time and in any place is also true at all times and in all places, or, what we call law, found anywhere will be found everywhere, though men may give it different names. What men call gravity holds in mental no less than in physical phenomena, and all physical phenomena, at their best, are dull and murky till they come up into spiritual life. As an illustration that every law has its universality, take the familiar law or principle that action and reaction are equal. What is this but reaping the whirlwind after one has sown the wind, or how does that natural law differ from this teaching, whatsoever a man soweth that shall he also reap? Are they aught but different strains in the great cosmic melody? Soon after I began to understand the paradoxical teachings of Jesus, as when he declared that, he that would save his life must lose it, and he that would lose it, for Jesus' sake, alone shall find it. The same in Paul, as having nothing yet possessing all things. From this it was but a step to a knowledge of the central principle of all spiritual life, namely, the giving of one's self for others. About 10 years ago, at the age of 60, I found myself tormented with that question with which intelligence has wrestled since there was any of that commodity in the earth, namely, the beginning of things. When in deep agony, a side light was flashed upon my soul, with almost blinding suddenness: if you could find a beginning, would not that beginning be itself an end? Hence, if you could find one end of things, would not that show you that there must also be another end? What? An end of all things, beyond which there could be only blankness, as there must have been before things began to be, if they did begin. No. There was no beginning and there can be no end. Since that moment's experience I have not been troubled as to the immortality of the soul, and I now think I never shall be again. 5 years ago I had an experience which has proved more fruitful to me perhaps than all others combined. I had a fall, striking on my head. I lost consciousness. In regaining possession of myself I passed through all the experiences of the race. In the first stage I simply was aware of the fact that I was something. What that was, I neither knew nor cared to know. I did not know what knowing was. I was calm, blissfully happy, and to me there was no past nor any future. There was to me no time, no place, no anything, save that tiny speck of consciousness, myself. As there was nothing to note duration, that stage might have been in duration incomprehensible. At any rate, such was its lesson to me. This stage of blissful existence was ended by my discovering that there was something about me which was not myself. I began to see, and seeing I began to reason, and so I at length found my objective world. As in the previous stage, I had no use for time, and so, to me, there was none. This stage might have lasted an eternity, so far as I took note of it. I was busy in studying myself first, and then the things about me, and so the infinite peace of my first experience was broken up. Unable to think otherwise, I concluded that what I saw must be like myself, and so I began my acquaintance with this outer world by transferring to its objects what I found in myself. This stage lasted in my experience from the moment I saw things about me to the dawn of experimental science. I then became acquainted with the beginning of all knowledge and especially of all religion. Of course, self-consciousness soon returned and I came back into my old world again. Since that hour my experience has seemed more than that of all my previous life. Nothing is now any longer dim or obscure. My spiritual expansion has been rapid in these 3 or 4 past years. I live in the world, but I seem to myself not of it. I enjoy what I must call spiritual vision. No sooner does the intellect seize upon a fact than I see it in its spiritual relations, no less than in its material, only much more clearly. The perfection of mathematics is simply a demonstration of the spiritual truth that God cannot lie. Natural phenomena are but the shadows of the spirit from which they spring, as the human face changes under the influence of love, hatred or fear. Color in nature, which washes all things in its warm waves, shows us what spiritual love would do if once let loose in the world. The Bible is simply a picture, which I see with infinite clearness. This vision seems to extend to the atom dance in nature, no less than through all laws, all knowledge, all science, all history and all religion. You set me a hard task when you bid me give the difference I perceive in myself since these experiences. I find no language in which I can tell of the things in this realm where I now am. I have not even discovered an alphabet. When, oh when, shall I be able to reveal its poetry? I see everywhere and in every object unceasing motion, and in that motion a creative force forever and forever repeating and re-repeating the same simple process as to infinity. Through all nature the grand rhythms roll and heaven and earth are filled with the melody. Men are but boys chasing shadows. The spiritual significance of the world none seem to see, the infinite simplicity of its processes none care to understand. Summary. This seems to the editor to be probably, though not certainly, a true case of cosmic consciousness, in which the cosmic plane was reached gradually, and not as usually happens per saltum. If it is not that, then it is a case of gradual ascent to the extreme limit of the self-conscious mind. In any case, the experience of H.B. is interesting and instructive and well deserves a place in this book. 22. R.P.S. Born 1830, died 1898. In a letter to the editor R.P.S. says, I was about 30 when this marvelous transforming baptism came to me. To it I attribute results 293 immensely disproportioned to my very moderate natural ability or knowledge. A scientific, accurate diagnosis of it all would be a most valuable contribution to human knowledge. The experience may now be given in R.P.S. own words, beginning, 140, 135. Having always known that upon conversion the believer received the Holy Spirit, and that his guidance and power would be known, when needed, in unfolding the treasures of Scriptures, in service or in trials. I had not looked for any other special manifestations of his presence. And yet there was a large class of passages in the Old and New Testament the conditions of which were not fully met by any consciousness of my own, full as had been the knowledge of pardon, adoption and standing in Christ. Nor yet by a later experience, which came to me 10 years after my conversion, of the wonderful inward cleansing of the blood from all sin. I had read, Whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him, shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. This was not true in my experience, in the full meaning evidently intended by the words. There did not always from my heart flow rivers of living water freely and spontaneously. Too often the force pump, rather than the fountain, would have represented my condition. As I gazed in the mirror of the Word, upon the glorious person of my Lord, my soul was often bowed in adoring love. But I had never come to know, 17 the Comforter in such a fullness that I could realize his indwelling presence as even better than that of the visible person of Jesus. I had read that as men were possessed by an evil spirit and led to do things far beyond their natural powers, so these, filled with the Spirit, seemed to be carried out of, and beyond, themselves. I had read the charge against the apostles, of being drunken, and that afterwards Paul brought the same thought of the elevation of wine, as the illustration of being filled with the Spirit. This seemed to be an ordained condition, since God's commands are always promises, just as his promises are commands, the promises being always larger than the commands. As yet I had never known, in my consciousness, a being thus filled with the Spirit, or the meaning of John the Baptist's declaration, He shall baptize you with the Holy Ghost and with fire. So ignorant was I, even in the matters of the greatest importance to my spiritual interests, that in finding the inward cleansing and the outward victory over sin, that faith which overcometh the world, I did not press beyond my educational habits of thought to recognize that a far more glorious manifestation of God was yet to be known by the Spirit. I then scarcely noticed that it was after our Lord had breathed on his disciples with the words, Receive ye the Holy Ghost, they had yet to wait 10 days at one time in prayerful expectation for the more full baptism of the Spirit. Nor that it was some time after this event that, when they had prayed, the place was shaken where they were assembled together, and they were all filled with the Holy Ghost. I was not, indeed, in the condition of the disciples, who as yet had not so much as heard whether there be any Holy Ghost, and yet I had formed no conception of what the promised baptism, with the Holy Ghost and with fire, could be. Deeply thankful for the privileges of sanctification through faith, realized in an unexpected fullness a few months before, I one day joined in the woods a few Christians who had met to wait before God for the baptism of the Spirit. Except a few low hymns or brief prayers, the half-hour was spent in solemn silence. At length there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing, mighty wind, and it filled all the place where they were sitting. No uninspired words could so describe my impressions. And yet no leaf above or blade of grass below was moved, all nature was still. It was to our souls, not to our senses, that the Lord revealed himself by the Spirit. My whole being seemed unutterably full of the God upon whom I had long believed. The perception of my senses could bring no such consciousness as now was mine. I understood the supersensual visions of Isaiah, Ezekiel and Paul. No created thing was now so real to my soul as the Creator himself. It was awful, yet without terror. I lost no part of my senses, and yet they were all wrapped up in the sublime manifestation. A question put to me was answered as briefly as possible, that my soul might lose nothing of the heavenly presence enwrapping and filling my being. I do not remember to have then told anyone of it, but days afterwards, when I rejoined my wife, she burst into tears as we met, before we had spoken a word, so great was the change in my appearance. Songs in the night season, the living waters welling up from my heart, came with the consciousness of waking. An awe, sweet but not burdensome, shadowed my spirit, as every moment was filled with the presence of God. Nor did it leave me in the midst of the most engrossing occupations. Life became a psalm of praise. This elevation of feeling necessarily subsided after a season, but it left me with an inner consciousness of God which is expressed by the words, "I will dwell in them and walk in them. We will come to him and make our abode with him." The scene upon the cross of Calvary became often more real than the senses could make it. Without the materiality of bodily sight, the holy countenance of Jesus, in its tender, suffering humanity, lightened by the glory of divinity, seems now to me to look down from the cross, upon assemblies, as I tell of redemption for sinners. It is painful to endeavor to speak of these things. My poor words seem rather to cover than to reveal them. Would that the glorious reality would be conveyed to other hearts. Here is a case of ascent into the full light of the morning before the actual rising of the sun. This man was highly privileged, but it was not given to him to see the heavens opened. He passed into the Brahmic bliss, but did not see, as far as it appears, the Brahmic splendor. 23, E.T. Born 1830. Entered cosmic consciousness 1860, AET. 30 years. The writer has, at present, no details to give in this case and only includes it for the age of illumination. XXIV, Case of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. We are indebted to Max Müller and to Pratap Chunder Mozumdar for such scanty details as we have in this case. Their evidence is perhaps all the more valuable, since the first named, at least, who is the principal reporter, 116, 306, has never shown in his writings any knowledge or appreciation of the faculty here called cosmic consciousness. Although his life work in Indian literature has brought him in contact with the more or less perfect expression of it 1,000 times. All that is done here is to epitomize such information as the reporters above named have given us. Ramakrishna Paramahansa was born in 1835, in a village near Jehanabad, Hooghly district, near Kamarpukur. His chief place of residence is said to have been at a temple of the goddess Kali, on the bank of the Ganges, near Calcutta. He died 1886, in the Kasipur Garden, 2 miles north of Calcutta. He is said to have exercised an extraordinary influence upon a large number of intelligent and highly educated men, including Pratap Chandra Mazumdar and Keshub Chandra Sen. A score of young men, who attached themselves closely to him, have, since his death, become ascetics. They follow his teaching by giving up the enjoyment of wealth and carnal pleasure, living together in a college and retiring at times to holy and solitary places. Besides these, we are told that a great number of men with their families are ardently devoted to his cause. Ramakrishna never moved in the world or was a man of the world. He seems, from the first, to have practiced severe asceticism. He was a Brahmin by caste, well-formed in body, but the austerities through which his character developed seem to have permanently disordered his system, leaving upon his features an appearance of debility, paleness and shrunkenness which excited compassion. Yet, in the midst of his emaciation, his face retained a fullness, a childlike tenderness, a profound visible humbleness, an unspeakable sweetness of expression, and a smile such as Mazumdar says he never saw on any other face. A Hindu saint is always particular about his externals. He wears the garua cloth, eats according to strict forms, refuses to have intercourse with men, is a rigid observer of caste, is always proud and professes secret wisdom. He is always a universal counselor and dispenser of charms. But the man Ramakrishna was singularly devoid of any such claims. His dress and diet did not differ from those of other men, except in the general negligence he showed towards both, and as to caste, he openly broke it every day. He repudiated the title of a teacher, showed displeasure at any exceptional honor which people tried to pay him, and he emphatically disclaimed the knowledge of secrets and mysteries. He worshipped no particular Hindu deity, neither Shiva, Vishnu, or the Saktis, and yet he accepted all the doctrines, the embodiments, the usages and devotional practices of every religious cult. Each in turn was infallible to him. His religion meant ecstasy, his worship transcendental insight, his whole nature burnt day and night with the permanent fire and fever of a strange faith and feeling. His conversation was a ceaseless breaking forth of his inward fire and lasted for long hours. He was often merged in rapturous ecstasy and outward unconsciousness during the day, particularly when he spoke of his favorite spiritual experiences or heard any striking response to them. Krishna became to him the incarnation of loving devotion, and we are told that, while meditating on him, his heart full of the burning love of God, his features would suddenly become stiff and motionless, his eyes lose their sight. And while completely unconscious himself, tears would run down his rigid, pale, yet smiling face. And while in that state he would sometimes break out into prayers, songs and utterances, the force and pathos of which would pierce through the hardest heart and bring tears to eyes that never wept before through the influence of religion. What is most extraordinary, his religion was not confined to the worship of Hindu deities. For long days he subjected himself to various kinds of discipline to realize the Mohammedan idea of all-powerful Allah. He let his beard grow, he fed on Muslim diet, he continually repeated sentences from the Quran. For Christ his reverence was deep and genuine. He bowed his head at the name of Jesus, honored the doctrine of his sonship, and once or twice attended Christian places of worship. He showed how it was possible to unify all the religions of the world by seeing only what is good in each one of them, and by sincere reverence for every one who has suffered for the truth, for their faith in God and for their love of men. He left nothing in writing. His friends wrote some of his sayings. He did not desire to found a sect. Here follow a few more or less characteristic passages from his teachings. How to get rid of the lower self. The blossom vanishes of itself as the fruit grows, so will your lower self vanish as the divine grows in you. So long as the heavenly expanse of the heart is troubled and disturbed by the gusts of desire, there is little chance of our beholding therein the luminary God. The beatific godly vision occurs only in the heart which is calm and wrapped in divine communion. The soiled mirror never reflects the rays of the sun. So the impure and the unclean in heart that are subject to Maya, illusion, never perceive the glory of Bhagwan, the Holy One. But the pure in heart see the Lord as the clear mirror reflects the sun. So be holy. A recently married young woman remains deeply absorbed in the performance of domestic duties, so long as no child is born to her. But no sooner is a son born to her than she begins to neglect household details, and does not find much pleasure in them. Instead thereof she fondles the newborn baby all the livelong day and kisses it with intense joy. Thus man in his state of ignorance is ever busy in the performance of all sorts of works, but as soon as he sees in his heart the Almighty God he finds no pleasure in them. On the contrary, his happiness consists now only in serving God and doing his works. He no longer finds happiness in any other occupation, and cannot draw himself from the ecstasy of the Holy Communion. As one can ascend to the top of a house by means of a ladder, or a bamboo, or a staircase, or a rope, so divers are the ways and means to approach God, and every religion in the world shows one of these ways. Why can we not see the Divine Mother? She is like a high-born lady, transacting all her business from behind the screen, seeing all, but seen by none. Her devout sons only see her by going near her, behind the screen of Maya. You see many stars at night in the sky, but find them not when the sun rises. Can you say there are no stars in the heavens of day? So, O man, because you behold not God in the days of your ignorance, say not that there is no God. In the play of hide and seek, if the player succeeds in touching the grand dame, Buri, he is no longer liable to be made a thief of by the seeker. Similarly, by once seeing God, man is no longer bound down by the fetters of the world. Just as the person touching the Buri is free to go about wherever he chooses without being pursued and made a thief of, so also in this world's playground there is no fear to him who has once touched the feet of God. He attains freedom from all worldly cares and anxieties, and nothing can ever bind him again. The pearl oyster that contains the precious pearl is in itself of very little value, but it is essential for the growth of the pearl. The shell itself may prove to be of no use to the man who has got the pearl. So ceremonies and rites may not be necessary for him who has attained the highest truth, God. A little boy wearing the mask of the lion's head looks indeed very terrible. He goes where his little sister is at play and yells out hideously, which at once shocks and terrifies his sister, making her cry out in the highest pitch of her voice in the agony of despair to escape from the clutch of the terrible being. But when her little tormentor puts off the mask, the frightened girl at once recognizes her loving brother and flies up to him, exclaiming, "Oh, it is my dear brother, after all." Even such is the case of all the men of the world who are deluded and frightened and led to do all sorts of things by the nameless power of Maya, or nescience, under the mask of which Brahman hides himself. But when the veil of Maya is taken from Brahman, the men then do not see in him a terrible and uncompromising master, but their own beloved other self. It cannot, perhaps, be proved, in the usual way, that Ramakrishna was a case of cosmic consciousness. We cannot point to the presence of the subjective light or to sudden illumination at a certain age. Still there is little doubt about the diagnosis, and we can readily understand our want of definite information, which is probably due to the fact that those who reported the case to us had no conception of its real nature. Or what were the characteristic and essential symptoms? To them subjective light, if they knew of it, would probably seem a matter of no consequence, and equally so the age and the more or less suddenness of the oncoming of such features in the case as they did report. XXV, case of J.H.J. A merchant in a pretty large way of business. The advent of the cosmic sense, which was momentary and incomplete, made no visible change in his life, and very few of the hundreds who knew him had the least suspicion that he ever had any experience out of the common. He is not regarded as a saint nor exactly as a sage, but he has many warm friends and is in several respects remarkably intelligent. He was born May 25, 1837. On the night of December 31, 1868, in the middle of his 32nd year, he had the following dream. It is not at all clear that the dream had any connection with the subsequent illumination. I give it in his own language as part of the case, and each reader may form his own opinion as to its importance. The writer, however, may say that it seems to him that the sense of intense light experienced in it, if not actually the subjective light that belongs to the oncoming of cosmic consciousness, bore some close relation to it. I thought, he writes. I was standing behind the counter of my shop in the middle of a bright, sunshiny afternoon, and instantly, in a flash, it became darker than the darkest night, darker than a mine, and the gentleman who was talking with me ran out into the street. Following him, although it was so dark, I could see hundreds and thousands of people pouring into the street, all wondering what had happened. Just then I noticed in the sky, in the far southwest, a bright light like a star, about the size of the palm of my hand, and in an instant it seemed to grow larger and larger and nearer, until it began to light up the darkness. When it got to the size of a man's hat, it divided itself into 12 smaller lights with a larger one in the center, and then very rapidly it grew much larger, and instantly I knew that this was the coming of Christ. The moment this thought occurred to me, the whole southwestern heavens became filled with a shining host, and in the center of it Christ and the 12 apostles. By this time it was lighter than the lightest day that could possibly be imagined, and as the shining host advanced toward the zenith, the friend with whom I was talking, exclaimed, "That is my Savior." And I thought he immediately left his body and ascended into the sky, and I thought I was not good enough to accompany him. Then I awoke. For some days afterwards I was very strongly impressed by this dream and could not tell it to anyone. In about a fortnight I told it to my family, afterwards to my Sunday school class, and since I have frequently repeated it. It was the most vivid dream I ever had. The rest of his experience is drawn from a letter, dated June 4, 1892. I had been for 3 years or more in the wine press. I knew there must be a place of rest, or else the whole Bible was a lie. I had, from a boy, read and thought much about the second coining, and, while I laughed at the millwrights and knew that they were idiotic in their expectations, yet I still had enough of the marvelous in me to be looking for a sudden change of some sort. One day, in the late spring of 1871, he was then just 34 years old, Mr. B., the J.B. of this volume, told my wife that my ease was a very curious one. Said he, "Your husband is born again and don't know it. He is a little spiritual baby, with eyes not yet open, but he will know it in a very short time." And about 3 weeks after that, about 7:45, while walking on 2nd Avenue, N.Y. with my wife, on my way to a lecture at the Liberal Club, I suddenly exclaimed to my wife, I have eternal life." I cannot say there was a tremendous, though there was a marked, exaltation. The prominent feeling was a sort of undying assurance that the Christ in me had arisen and would remain in everlasting consciousness, and it has. There was a time after this, 3 years later, in August, 1874, on a Long Branch boat, when in a crowd of people, sitting, leaning back in my chair, I had an experience of the greatest mental and spiritual exaltation, when it seemed as if my whole soul, and body, too, were suffused with light. But this never made me forget the first experience, which, while something like the latter, was not so transporting. 26. T.S.R. Born 1840. Entered cosmic consciousness in 1872, at the age of 32 years. Was a member of a Presbyterian church in good standing. Upon illumination left the church and has had no connection with any similar organization since. Was always an earnest, thoughtful man. In 1872, an informant says, his friends thought for a time that he was becoming insane. He passed through a grave spiritual crisis, the exact nature of which is not known to me. 294 Whatever it was, it, to all appearance, passed over, and he has been ever since not only sane but exceptionally intelligent and right-minded. He is the best read Emerson scholar that I know. In all his home relations, by wife, children and friends, he is greatly beloved. He has a positive certainty of individual immortality. He is a very modest man, but has a certain air or manner which impresses those who meet him that he, being a mere clerk, is a richer man than his millionaire employers, and that he knows it. 27. W. H. W. Born 1842. Entered cosmic consciousness 1877, at the age of 35 years. Had a very strong and original mind and a wonderful memory. A gentleman who knew him writes, he was an extraordinary conversationalist. It was as if he had absorbed the minds and works of Darwin, Huxley and Spencer, and spoke with the authority and knowledge of all three. Their works, thought, language, were at his tongue's end. It was an education to be with him for a few days. He was a wonderful violinist, the equal of the best not known as a star. He heard of J.B., the J.B. of this volume, in 1877, sent for him and had a 5 hours talk with him. He had a capacity of taking in a case, subject, book, musical composition, what not, and retaining permanently all he heard or read about it. He asked for another interview, and after a second talk of 2 hours said, "Now, Mr. B., I have done. I have just one more question to ask you, and only one. Have you got what the scientists might call a new prime?" "I have," replied B. "And I can further add that you will get it, too. I don't know when, but you will get it." J.B. went back to his own city that afternoon. The following afternoon he received a telegram from W.H.W., "I have got that prime." I afterwards heard him describe the experience. He said, "I went into the yard to the pump, and just as I got there it came, a shock, a flood of light, and along with, or immediately following, the shock and the subjective glow, like a great internal blaze, came the feeling of absolute harmony with the power that made all things and is in all things. All striving stopped, there was nothing to strive for, I was at peace." XXIII. Richard Jefferies. Born November 6, 1848, died August 14, 1887. This case is given as that of a man who spent several years in what has been called above the twilight of cosmic consciousness but upon whom the sun did not rise. In this connection the man is an exceedingly interesting study to all those who care about the subject matter of the present volume. And the more so because he has written a book in which he gives us what is undoubtedly a straightforward and candid account of his spiritual life down to his 35th year, 105. He seems to have entered early into the twilight above referred to, and it seems probable that Jefferies would have entered into at least momentary cosmic consciousness at about the usual age had it not been that before that time came. When 33 years old, he was seized with a fatal sickness which weakened and tortured him from that time until his death, which took place in his 39th year. Be this as it may, the book named represents the highest spiritual altitude attained by Jefferies, a spiritual altitude clearly above that of mere self-consciousness and as clearly below the mental status of complete cosmic consciousness. The book, of course, should be read as a whole, and it will well repay perusal, but for the purposes of the present volume the passages found below must suffice. The story of my heart commences 17 years ago, 105, 1. I was not more than 1895 when an inner and esoteric meaning began to come to me from all the visible universe, and undefinable aspirations filled me, 105, 181. I was utterly alone with the sun and the earth. Lying down on the grass, I spoke in my soul to the earth, the sun, the air, and the distant sea far beyond sight. I thought of the earth's firmness, I felt it bear me up. Through the grassy couch there came an influence as if I could feel the great earth speaking to me. I thought of the wandering air, its pureness, which is its beauty, the air touched me and gave me something of itself, 105:4. By all these I prayed. I felt an emotion of the soul beyond all definition, 105:5. I thought of my inner existence, 296, that consciousness which is called the soul. These, that is, myself, I threw into the balance to weigh the prayer the heavier. My strength of body, mind and soul, I flung into it, I put forth my strength, I wrestled and labored and toiled in might of prayer. The prayer, this soul emotion, was in itself, not for an object, it was a passion. I hid my face in the grass, I was wholly prostrated, I lost myself in the wrestle, I was wrapped and carried away, 105:7. Had any shepherd accidentally seen me lying on the turf he would only have thought that I was resting a few minutes. I made no outward show. Who could have imagined the whirlwind of passion that was going on within me as I reclined there? I was greatly exhausted when I reached home, 105:8. Having drunk deeply of the heaven above 297 and felt the most glorious beauty of the day, and remembering the old sea, which, as it seemed to me, was but just yonder at the edge, I now became lost and absorbed into the being or existence of the universe. I felt down deep into the earth under, and high above into the sky, and farther still to the sun and stars. Still farther beyond the stars into the hollow of space, and losing thus my separateness of being came to seem like a part of the whole. 105:8-9. With all that time and power I prayed that I might have in my soul the intellectual part of it, the idea, the thought. 105:17. Now, this moment gives me all the thought, all the idea, all the soul expressed in the cosmos around me. 105:18. Gives me fullness of life like to the sea and the sun, to the earth and the air, gives me fullness of physical life, mind, equal and beyond their fullness, gives me a greatness and perfection of soul higher than all things. Gives me my inexpressible desire which swells in me like a tide, gives it to me with all the force of the sea. 105:103. I realize a soul life illimitable, I realize the existence of a cosmos of thought. 105:51. I believe in the human form. Let me find something, some method, by which that form may achieve the utmost beauty. Its beauty is like an arrow, which may be shot any distance according to the strength of the bow. So the idea expressed in the human shape is capable of indefinite expansion and elevation of beauty. Of the mind, the inner consciousness, the soul, my prayer desired that I might discover a mode of life for it, so that it might not only conceive of such a life, but actually enjoy it on the earth. I wish to search out a new and higher set of ideas on which the mind should work. The simile of a new book of the soul is the nearest to convey the meaning, a book drawn from the present and future, not the past. Instead of a set of ideas based on tradition, let me give the mind a new thought drawn straight from the wondrous present, direct this very hour. 105:30. Recognizing my own inner consciousness. 298. The psyche, so clearly, death did not seem to me to affect the personality. In dissolution there was no bridgeless chasm, no unfathomable gulf of separation. The spirit did not immediately become inaccessible, leaping at a bound to an immeasurable distance. 105:34. To me everything is supernatural. 105:42. It is impossible to wrest the mind down to the same laws that rule pieces of timber. 105:42. When I consider that I dwell this moment in the eternal now 299 that has ever been and will be, that I am in the midst of immortal things this moment, that there probably are souls as infinitely superior to mine as mine to a piece of timber, what then is a miracle. 105:44. I feel on the margin of a life unknown, 300 very near, almost touching it, on the verge of powers which, if I could grasp, would give me an immense breadth of existence. 105:45. Sometimes a very ecstasy of exquisite enjoyment of the entire universe filled me. 105:182. I want more ideas of soul life. I am certain that there are more yet to be found. A great life, an entire civilization, lies just outside the pale of common thought. 105:48. There is an entity, a soul entity, as yet unrecognized. 105:48. 301. Man has a soul, as yet it seems to me lying in abeyance, by the aid of which he may yet discover things now deemed supernatural. 105:144. I believe, with all my heart. 302. In the body in the flesh, and believe that it should be increased and made more beautiful by every means. 105:114. That the organs of the body may be stronger in their action, perfect and lasting. That the exterior flesh may yet be more beautiful, that the shape may be finer, and the motions more graceful. 105:29. I believe all manner of asceticism to be the vilest blasphemy, blasphemy towards the whole of the human race. I believe in the flesh and the body, which is worthy of worship. 105:114. How can I adequately express my contempt for the assertion 303 that all things occur for the best, for a wise and beneficent end, and are ordered by a human intelligence? It is the most utter falsehood and a crime against the human race. 105, 134. Nothing is evolved. There is no evolution any more than there is any design in nature. By standing face to face with nature, and not from books, I have convinced myself that there is no design and no evolution. What there is, what was the cause, how and why, is not yet known. Certainly it was neither of these. 105, 126. There is nothing human in any living animal. All nature, the universe as far as we can see, is anti- or ultra-human, outside, and has no concern with man. 105, 62. There being nothing human in nature in the universe, and all things being ultra-human and without design, shape, or purpose, I conclude that no deity has anything to do with nature. 105, 63. Next, in human affairs, in the relations of man with man, in the conduct of life, in the events that occur, in human affairs generally, everything happens by chance. 105:64. But as everything in human affairs obviously happens by chance, it is clear that no deity is responsible. 105:66. I have been obliged to write these things 304 by an irresistible impulse which has worked in me since early youth. They have not been written for the sake of argument, still less for any thought of profit, rather, indeed, the reverse. They have been forced from me by earnestness of heart, and they express my most serious convictions. 105, 181. One of the greatest difficulties I have encountered is the lack of words to express ideas. 105:184. Zix, case of C.M.C. in her own words. It is important to clearly realize that in writing the following pages C.M.C. and the same may be truly said of every person whose evidence is included in this volume, had no prior or contemporary case before her mind upon which, if she were capable of so doing, she could have modeled her narrative. This latter is, beyond all question, a faithful account, as simple and straightforward as she could make it, of her actual psychological experience as she lived through it. I was born in the year 1844. I have been told that as a child I never seemed young, that is, that along with my youth there was an air of thoughtfulness that belongs to more advanced years. 305 I cannot remember a time when I did not think and wonder about God. The beauty and sublimity of nature have always, from early childhood, impressed me deeply. Went to church and Sunday school, listened attentively to the prayers and sermons, thought over the latter more than was probably supposed. The sermons were old-time Presbyterian, the day of judgment, the sinner's lost condition, the unpardonable sin, and all those things so dreadful to a serious, imaginative child. The older I grew and the more I thought, the more puzzled and bewildered I became. Over the sufferings of Jesus I wept bitter tears, grieving that my sins should have nailed him to the cross. How he could be God I could not understand, yet never doubted but that it must be true. I studied the Bible and Catechism MK and especially the Confession of Faith, not only because it was a duty but because I felt as if I must find out the truth about things. How terribly I felt when I learned that without the gospel the heathen could not be saved. The cruelty and injustice of it made me almost hate God for making the world so. I joined the church, however, thinking that it might bring me peace and rest. But although feeling more safe I was just as far as ever from being satisfied. While still quite a girl we began taking some rather liberal church papers which I read and which were to a certain extent a comfort to me, since they showed me that the narrow doctrines in which I had been brought up were not the whole of Christianity. At this time, Paradise Lost, Pollok's Course of Time and Pilgrim's Progress were favorite books. The Course of Time, however, left me depressed for many weeks. The vastness and grandeur of the God which I felt in nature I could never reconcile with the God in the Bible, try as I would, and of course I felt myself a wicked skeptic in consequence. So it went on, and though to all appearance I was happy and full of life like other girls, there was always that undercurrent, a vein of sadness deep down, out of sight. Often as I have walked out under the stars, looking up into those silent depths with unspeakable longing for some answer to the wordless questions within me, I have dropped down upon the ground in a perfect agony of aspiration. But if the stars knew the secret I sought, they gave no sign. My experience was no doubt ordinary, largely that of the average girl living the average commonplace life, with aspirations and ideals to all appearance beyond any hope of fulfillment. At 22 I was married. 10 years later a change of place broke up the old routine of my life, giving me new associates and new interests. I was thrown into relation with people of more liberal tendencies, and soon began reading the books and magazines, Popular Science Monthly, etc., which I found in the hands of my new acquaintances. Tyndall's Belfast Address, one of the books in question, was the first really thoughtful book, from the point of view of modern science, I had ever read, and it was a revelation to me. From that time, without my going very deeply into the subject, a general idea of evolution was gained, and gradually the old conceptions gave place to more rational ones, and more in accordance with my own feelings. The questions of design or purpose in nature, of individual immortality, etc., were left for scientific research to discover, if to be discovered at all. My attitude was that of an agnostic. There I rested, not altogether content, it is true. 306 something in life had been missed which it seemed ought to be there, depths in my own nature which had never been sounded, heights I could see, which had not been reached. The chasm between what I was and what I needed to be was deep and wide, but as this same incompleteness was obvious in the lives of others, it was accepted as my share in the common lot. But now into this life, past its meridian and apparently fixed for good or ill, was to come a new element, which should transform me, my life and the world to me. The soul, the deeper self, was to awake, and demand its own. An irresistible force was to be aroused which should, with mighty throes, rend the veil behind which nature hides her secrets. An illness, combining extreme bodily prostration with equally extreme mental and emotional disturbance, revealed to me the depths in my own nature. After some months my strength was restored and my mental condition to some extent improved, but the deep unrest remained. With the power to suffer came the power of sympathy with all suffering. What I had hitherto known or realized of life was as the prick of a pin to the thrust of a dagger. I had been living on the surface. Now I was going down into the depths, and as I went deeper and deeper the barriers which had separated me from my fellow men were broken down, the sense of kinship with every living creature had deepened. So that I was oppressed with a double burden. Was I never to know rest or peace again? It seemed not. Life had many blessings, home, husband, children, friends, yet it was with dismay that I thought of the coming years till death should set me free. Walt Whitman, in Leaves of Grass, had portrayed with wonderful power and sublimity this phase of mental and spiritual development, as those who look deeply into their own natures must see. In those wonderful poems nature herself utters her voice, pouring out the elemental pain and passion in living, burning words as lava is poured in torrents from the crater of a volcano, not his voice alone, but that of the soul of humanity imprisoned, struggling to break the bonds which enclose and hold it in. How sweet to lean upon that great soul! To feel that tender human sympathy! And seeing what heights he had reached, and knowing the road he had traveled, what courage! Passing over the interval between this time and September, 1893, as unimportant, except for the constant struggle within me, I proceed to describe, as well as may be, the supreme event of my life, which undoubtedly is related to all else. And is the outcome of those years of passionate search. I had come to see that my need was greater even than I had thought. The pain and tension deep in the core and center of my being was so great that I felt as might some creature which had outgrown its shell, and yet could not escape. What it was I knew not, except that it was a great yearning, for freedom, for larger life, for deeper love. There seemed to be no response in nature to that infinite need. The great tide swept on uncaring, pitiless, and strength gone, every resource exhausted, nothing remained but submission. So I said, there must be a reason for it, a purpose in it, even if I cannot grasp it. The power in whose hands I am may do with me as it will. It was several days after this resolve before the point of complete surrender was reached. Meantime, with every internal sense, I searched for that principle, whatever it was, which would hold me when I let go. At last, subdued, with a curious, growing strength in my weakness, I let go of myself. 307 In a short time, to my surprise, I began to feel a sense of physical comfort, of rest, as if some strain or tension was removed. Never before had I experienced such a feeling of perfect health. I wondered at it. And how bright and beautiful the day! I looked out at the sky, the hills and the river, amazed that I had never before realized how divinely beautiful the world was. The sense of lightness and expansion kept increasing, the wrinkles smoothed out of everything, there was nothing in all the world that seemed out of place. At dinner I remarked, how strangely happy I am today. If I had realized then, as I did afterwards, what a great thing was happening to me, I should doubtless have dropped my work and given myself up to the contemplation of it. But it seemed so simple and natural, with all the wonder of it, that I and my affairs went on as usual. The light and color glowed, the atmosphere seemed to quiver and vibrate around and within me. Perfect rest and peace and joy were everywhere, and, more strange than all, there came to me a sense as of some serene, magnetic presence grand and all-pervading. The life and joy within me were becoming so intense that by evening I became restless and wandered about the rooms, scarcely knowing what to do with myself. Retiring early that I might be alone, soon all objective phenomena were shut out. I was seeing and comprehending the sublime meaning of things, the reasons for all that had before been hidden and dark. The great truth that life is a spiritual evolution, that this life is but a passing phase in the soul's progression, burst upon my astonished vision with overwhelming grandeur. Oh, I thought, if this is what it means, if this is the outcome, then pain is sublime. Welcome centuries, eons, of suffering if it brings us to this. And still the splendor increased. Presently what seemed to be a swift, oncoming tidal wave of splendor and glory ineffable came down upon me, and I felt myself being enveloped, swallowed up. I felt myself going, losing myself. 308 Then I was terrified, but with a sweet terror. I was losing my consciousness, my identity, but was powerless to hold myself. Now came a period of rapture, so intense that the universe stood still, as if amazed at the unutterable majesty of the spectacle. Only one in all the infinite universe. The all-loving, the perfect one. The perfect wisdom, truth, love and purity. And with the rapture came the insight. In that same wonderful moment of what might be called supernal bliss, came illumination. I saw with intense inward vision the atoms or molecules, of which seemingly the universe is composed, I know not whether material or spiritual, rearranging themselves, as the cosmos, in its continuous, everlasting life, passes from order to order. 309 What joy when I saw there was no break in the chain, not a link left out, everything in its place and time. Worlds, systems, all blended in one harmonious whole. Universal life, synonymous with universal love. How long that period of intense rapture 310 lasted I do not know, it seemed an eternity, it might have been but a few moments. Then came relaxation, the happy tears, the murmured, rapturous expression. I was safe. I was on the great highway, the upward road which humanity had trod with bleeding feet, but with deathless hope in the heart and songs of love and trust on the lips. I understood, now, the old eternal truths, yet fresh and new and sweet as the dawn. How long the vision lasted I cannot tell. In the morning I awoke with a slight headache, but with the spiritual sense so strong that what we call the actual, material things surrounding me seemed shadowy and unreal. My point of view was entirely changed. Old things had passed away and all had become new. The ideal had become real, the old real had lost its former reality and had become shadowy. This shadowy unreality of external things did not last many days. Every longing of the heart was satisfied. 311 Every question answered, the pent-up, aching rivers had reached the ocean, I loved infinitely and was infinitely loved. The universal tide flowed in upon me in waves of joy and gladness, pouring down over me as in torrents of fragrant balm. This describes an actual sensation. 3:12 The infinite love and tenderness seemed to really stream down over me like holy oil, healing all my hurts and bruises. How foolish, how childish, now seemed petulance and discontent in presence of that serene majesty. I had learned the grand lesson, that suffering is the price which must be paid for all that is worth having. That in some mysterious way we are refined and sensitized, doubtless largely by it, so that we are made susceptible to nature's higher and finer influences. This, if true of one, is true of all. And feeling and knowing this, I do not now rave as once I did, but am silent as I sit and look out upon all the sorrow of the world, upon all the meanness and agony without end. That sweet eternal smile on nature's face. 3:13 There is nothing in the universe to compare with it, such joyous repose and sweet unconcern, saying to us, with tenderest love, all is well, always has been and will always be. The subjective light, it seems to me, is magnetic or electric, some force is liberated in the brain and nervous system, some explosion takes place, the fire that burned in the breast is now a mounting flame. On several occasions, weeks after the illumination described, I distinctly felt electric sparks shoot from my eyes. In my experience the subjective light was not something seen, a sensation as distinct from an emotion, it was emotion itself, ecstasy. It was the gladness and rapture of love, so intensified that it became an ocean of living, palpitating light, the brightness of which outshone 3:14 the brightness of the sun. Its glow, warmth and tenderness filling the universe. That infinite ocean was the eternal love, the soul of nature and all one endless smile. What astonished me beyond all else was, as the months went on, from that September, a deepening sense of a holy presence. There was a hush on everything, as if nature were holding her breath in adoration. There were times when the feeling came over me with such force as to become oppressive, almost painful. It would not have surprised me if the very rocks and hills had burst forth in one great anthem of praise. At times I felt as if they must, to relieve my feelings. The rent veil, the Holy of Holies, the cherubim with folded wings, tabernacles, and temples, I saw that they were symbols, the attempts of man to give expression to an inward experience. Nature touched me too closely. I sometimes felt oppressed by it, such extreme exaltation exhausted me, and I was glad when I could have a common day. I looked forward with somewhat of dread to the summer, and when it came its light and its profusion of color, although delightful, were almost more than I could bear. We think we see, but we are really blind, if we could see. One day, for a moment, my eyes were opened. It was in the morning, in the early summer of 1894, I went out in happy, tranquil mood, to look at the flowers, 3:15 putting my face down into the sweet peas, enjoying their fragrance, observing how vivid and distinct were their form and color. The pleasure I felt deepened into rapture, I was thrilled through and through, and was just beginning to wonder at it, when deep within me a veil, or curtain, suddenly parted, and I became aware that the flowers were alive and conscious. They were in commotion. And I knew they were emitting electric sparks. What a revelation it was! The feeling that came to me with the vision is indescribable. I turned and went into the house, filled with unspeakable awe. There was and is still, though not so noticeable as earlier, a very decided and peculiar feeling across the brow above the eyes, as of tension gone, a feeling of more room. That is the physical sensation. The mental is a sense of majesty, of serenity, which is more noticeable when out of doors. 3:16 Another very decided and peculiar effect followed the phenomena above described, that of being centered, or of being a center. It was as if surrounding and touching me closely on all sides were the softest, downiest pillows. Lean in what direction I might there they were. A pillow or pillows which fitted every tired spot, so that though I was distinctly conscious of that lightest touch there was not the least resistance or obstruction to movement, and yet the support was as permanent and solid as the universe. It was the everlasting arms. I was anchored at last. But to what? To something outside myself. The consciousness of completeness and permanence in myself is one with that of the completeness and permanence of nature. 3:17 This feeling is quite distinct from any that I had before illumination and has sprung from that. I often ponder on it and wonder what has happened, what change can have taken place in me to so poise and individualize me. My feeling is as if I were as distinct and separate from all other beings and things as is the moon in space and at the same time indissolubly one with all nature. Out of this experience was born an unfaltering trust. Deep in the soul, below pain, below all the distraction of life, is a silence vast and grand, an infinite ocean of calm, which nothing can disturb, nature's own exceeding peace, which passes understanding. That which we seek with passionate longing, here and there, upward and outward, we find at last within ourselves. The kingdom within. The indwelling God. Are words whose sublime meaning we never shall fathom. The subjoined note was sent the editor by a younger sister of C.M.C. in reply to inquiry made by him as to whether or not any change in the appearance of C.M.C. had been noticed at the time of or subsequent to her experiences given above. The note is dated February 2d, 1895, and is, word for word, as follows. It was in December, 3 months after, that I saw my sister for the first time after the experience described. And her changed appearance made such a deep impression on me that I shall never forget it. Her looks and manner were so changed that she scarcely seemed the same person. There was a clear, bright, peaceful light in her eyes, lighting her whole face, and she was so happy and contented, so satisfied with things as they were. It seemed as though some heavy weight had been lifted and she was free. As she talked to me I felt that she was living in a new world of thought and feeling unknown to me. Sincerely, P.M. XXX, the case of M.C.L. in his own words. Born about January, 1853. It is a difficult matter to write about myself, especially touching an experience which for 4 or 5 years has been one of the most sacredly guarded events of my life. Dr. M. described to me your theory of cosmic consciousness, which I at once recognized as defining, in a general way, a certain experience in my own life. I did not communicate the details to the doctor. I never had to anyone, lest I should be charged with superstition or madness. Early in my career a reputation as a popular preacher was won, and the power to interest and hold an audience achieved. As a minister I wrestled with the intellectual problems of the age, not only in the theological but in the physical, sociological and psychical realms. My desire for information was eager, and the search for truth honest and persistent. In the month of February, 1890, just following my 37th birthday, Reverend J. E. L. of Canada, came to assist me in a series of special meetings in my church. My affection for him gained during his stay. He had been gone 3 days when, thinking of him far through the night, the gray of the morning was already in the heavens, the conviction came to me that in him I had met an incarnation of Christ. I stood a moment transfixed with the thought. Was that which I had held as a theory to be realized as a fact? My friend was forgotten in the vision of Christ, who had come to me, not from without, but through the gates which open inwardly. I knew him, was conscious of him in my own spirit, soul and body. Then with that unfolding consciousness there came a suffusion, as of a delicate cloud or haze, which searched the entire body, was more invasive than light, more penetrating than heat, more enreaching than electricity. It was as if I had been plunged into a bath of fluid more subtle and permeating than ether. Against the inflow and outflow of that enswathing essence the body was not as resistant as the air to a bird's wing or a morning mist to the sunbeam. The rapture, the exaltation, the divinity of that moment passes knowledge. Then swiftly came the awe of the mysterious presence that filled me, and the consciousness of the whole creation, universe, went thrilling through me, not as a thought, a sensation, an emotion, but as the vital breath of God. This grew until I found myself rising and expanding into the infinite, being diffused and lost therein, and the mind and body reeled. Feeling myself falling, I exclaimed, "The vision is too much. I cannot look upon the face of God and live. Father in heaven, it is enough." And the voice answered. I sank on my bed and slept like a child. A few hours later I woke in joy which was unspeakable and full of glory. I knew what Paul meant by the unspeakable gift. The experience was to me the election, the calling of sonship to do the Father's will. I went to my pulpit vibrant from subjection to the holy breath, and preached upon the text, and I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me. The sermon became intense. I saw the cross before me as the necessity of my life. Its agony and fear possessed me, the mind could not bear up under it, I staggered from my pulpit, the congregation awed by the anguish on my face and in my words. My family were alarmed and a physician was called. He pronounced that I was suffering from nervous prostration, but found no symptoms of insanity, the horror of which had oppressed me. The exhaustion was such that I felt the need of rest and went to my mother, in the old homestead among the hills of Connecticut. To her I told the story. She said, "My boy, I have been expecting this. Now you know the truth of a living Christ." The character of my preaching completely changed. 318 The old popularity has waned, but larger powers of mind have come and the perception of truth is clearer. The holy breath kills lust, passion, hate. Fills the heart with laughter and the soul with peace. I know the eternal Christ of Paul and John, the Christ manifested in the Nazarene, and who in the manifestation was the interpretation of the cosmic consciousness of the past and the typal form of the new race in whom that consciousness is evolved. It is the race of the sons of God, who, like Moses, have stood in the presence and been bathed in the glory of his beauty in the blessedness of his joy. Cosmic consciousness is the light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. In answer to a request for further particulars MCL adds. The haze or light was more felt than seen. The nearest approach to the sensation I ever knew was experienced when I was at Niagara and visited the Cave of the Winds. And also when, from my window, at Hotel Coutet, in Chamonix, I saw the sun rise on Mont Blanc. The tinge, subtler than the waves of color, was that of these experiences, a fluid beryl or watery emerald. The mind slowly passed from fear into a distinct consciousness of some seemingly extranatural event. At first my thought was, this is a stroke of paralysis, and I tested every function of body and mind. Then the mind opened to understand something of what was going on. It kept pace with the sensation, and each progress of experience involved a mental process. I am inclined to locate the point of contact in the mind. I use the word mind as synonymous with the psyche, which of course involves the personality. I always have believed that the event primarily was subjective, but a subjective experience which was in perfect accord with the entire objective universe. It was the exaltation of the subjective in me to a new relation with the objective in earth and heaven. This is the first attempt I have ever made to give a verbal history of that holy hour, and it has been with something of a feeling of hesitancy that I have written, but what is written is written. XXXI, case of J.W.W., largely in his own words. He was born August 11, 1853. The date of his illumination was January 20, 1885. He is an architect. He has always been an earnest man, anxious to know the right and to do it. After the momentary attainment of cosmic consciousness he became still more bent upon pursuing the same path. Before his illumination he was an agnostic and skeptic, as the annexed autobiographic sketch will show. Not only did he not believe but he had no hope. After illumination he never again doubted the infinite beneficence of the central and overruling power of the universe. Although in this case the cosmic sense came for a moment only and then passed away, probably for the remainder of life, yet was the man by it incredibly ennobled. That seems the best term for the change that took place in him. Though not a Buddha, a Christ or a Whitman, he was, from that time, clearly superior to the average man. In proof of which statement the fact may be cited that a number of the best young men of his town sought him out and constituted him, under the name of Master, their spiritual leader. These men have, as the present writer can personally testify, for years tendered this man their personal affection and reverence for no other reason than that they saw clearly in him a superior spiritual nature. which superiority was never detected or suspected in him until after the oncoming of the cosmic sense in 1885. J.W.W. has since his illumination devoted his life to the intellectual and moral elevation of himself and his friends. Here follows an autobiographic sketch, written for the purpose of showing in what manner and under what circumstances he entered into the new life. The pages were not written for this book nor at the instigation of the writer of it. They were, in fact, written before the present writer knew J.W.W., and for that reason are all the more valuable in this place. Neither were they written to illustrate or support any theory. J.W.W. had and has no theory on the subject. All he knows, or perhaps cares to know, in this connection is that he at that moment entered into relation with a higher form of life, and learned, as Paul says, unspeakable things, such things, at all events, as were and are of quite unspeakable importance to him, any doubt of the truth of which things has been, and, as he thinks, always will be, entirely out of the question. J.W.W. Then, addressing his intimate friends, the young and middle-aged men mentioned above, who surround him, and, as said, call him Master, spoke as follows. Today, the 20th of January, 1890, is the anniversary of my mother's death, 5 years ago. I have decided to celebrate it by giving you some account of circumstances which I have hitherto kept to myself, and sacred in the recesses of my own heart and memory. I need not tell you, I think, that my mother's last illness and death were, by immeasurable odds, the heaviest grief and pain I have ever known, or shall, probably, ever know. But it is also true that the memory of them is for all time my most precious and priceless possession. That period was the supreme moment of my life and its deepest experience. In ordinary life we live only on the surface of things, our attention distracted endlessly by the shallowest illusions and baubles. We discuss with a light heart, and very much at our own ease, the great problems we have been discussing lately in the college, of immortality and the infinite goodness, but are not deeply concerned in them, and care but little what their solutions may be. But a great bereavement strips the scales from our eyes and compels us, in the intense solitude of our own souls, to gaze into the unfathomable depths in which we float and to question their vast and solemn meanings. It comes upon us clothed in thick darkness and mystery, and pierces our hearts with unutterable agony and grief, but it may be that the darkest hours of its visitation, the supreme moment itself, may also prove a revelation to our souls of the highest and bring us into the very presence of the infinite love and tenderness. For myself I cannot doubt that this was my own experience. To speak of it is to profane it. I am unworthy to so much as hint at it. But it has been the comfort of my life ever since. Alas, for the years that have followed. One momentary glimpse into the ineffable brightness, followed by gathering clouds and darkness, painful stumblings and wide errors, unsupported by any recognizable spiritual aid or presence. The heavens deaf and careless to my most earnest prayers and agonizings, nay, even slighting them, so far as appeared. But through it all, like the steadfast shining of a clear star, the memory of that sacred time has remained deep in my heart, and I have never really doubted for a moment that an infinite wisdom and love does encircle all our lives, tender, pitying and sympathizing. We may pass our lives without ever realizing it, doubting it, nay, flatly denying it. But it is there. And he to whom the vision has ever come at all, though in the briefest transient flash of momentary consciousness, can never again forget it. Though his whole after path may be enveloped in darkness and he himself may fall into gross error and backsliding. I received the ordinary orthodox training of the Presbyterian Church. I was baptized and was a regular attendant at church and Sunday school till well on in my teens. I attribute at least equal importance, in the formative elements of my religious training, to the daily practice at home, while I was a boy, of family worship. I recall now, as I write, with reverent emotion, the tender tones of my mother's voice, as it pleaded especially for her only deeply loved child. I was always a lover of books, and I was not far in my teens before I began to learn something of the opposition between the teaching of science and many of the beliefs I had been taught. This discovery was a gradual one, and I will only give a brief outline of the position in which I was ultimately landed. I learned that the first chapter of Genesis was, at least, a very crude statement of the actual fact. At one time I was an ardent and enthusiastic student of Hugh Miller's books and rested content with the reconciliation he sought to establish between the teaching of his beloved science, geology, and the biblical record. But I had to give it up when I came to read and study Darwin's and other books and to acquaint myself with the most recent geological discoveries. I remember well the enthusiasm with which I copied in writing Professor Huxley's famous address to the geological section of the British Association, in which he traced the pedigree of the horse to its progenitors in the Eocene period and the clear evidence of its evolution. Darwinism demolished for me the biblical account of creation, the authority of the Bible and the account it gives of the origin of evil and the fall of man. This last clearly involves the whole theological superstructure based upon it, including the so-called scheme of redemption and the doctrine of the atonement. The legends of the flood, the Tower of Babel, the dispersion of man and the origin of different languages were minor matters of comparatively trifling importance. I remember the delight with which I read Tyndall's book on Heat as a Mode of Motion, and reread it again and again. I read, too, his lectures on sound. These were my introduction to physics, from which I learned the great doctrines of the conservation and correlation of forces, as I had previously learned to realize in some degree the unity and uniformity of nature. In presence of such majestic and august conceptions the ordinary ideas of prayer and miracles seemed childish. I remember reading Tyndall's Fragments of Science and feeling this yet more strongly. I came in time to abandon the habit of prayer entirely. One cannot read much in physiological science without serious reflection on the nature of consciousness, the relation between mind and physical structure and the bearings of all this on the belief in personal immortality. It has always seemed clear to me that the only logical outcome of the considerations put forward by science are flatly and altogether opposed to such belief. To sum up, science destroyed for me all belief in the biblical legends of the creation and the fall of man, etc. And in the doctrine of the atonement, and at least gravely questioned all narratives of miracle, the probability of answer to prayer and the idea of personal immortality. The whole idea, too, of the divine incarnation of Christ on our insignificant atom of a world seemed out of keeping with the august spectacle of the infinite universe and its immeasurable duration. But my reading was never exclusively scientific, and my thoughts accordingly were always modified by other considerations. I learned something of Descartes, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel and Spinoza. What the effect of it all was upon me it is impossible for me now to analyze or to tell. But let a man once get fairly into his head the teaching of Kant that time and space only exist as the condition of our consciousness, and the discussion of immortality will seem irrelevant, he will feel the very basis of his speculations crumble beneath his feet. From my earliest youth I have acknowledged two masters, to whom I continually turned and whom I have studied with ever fresh interest and delight, Carlyle and Emerson, two widely different men but fundamentally alike in the absolute honesty and sincerity of their teaching, their noble and heroic character, and their steady, lifelong consecration to the service of the highest. Both of them rejected the materialistic conception of the world, which they regarded as spiritual in its essence, and each believed in his own way in a divine purpose, Emerson with genial and growing optimism, Carlyle with an accompanying Hebraic sense of the mystery and terror of evil. But neither from Carlyle nor Emerson will a student derive any firm conviction on the subject of individual immortality. Carlyle preferred to leave it a mystery, about which nothing can be definitely said with true assurance, but about which much may be hoped. Emerson, in the main, really believed it, but may be quoted on both sides of the subject. The questions we lust to have answered are, he declared, a confession of sin. He preached an unconditional submission and trust. Believe with all your heart and soul that all is well and ask no questions. If it is best that you should continue you will do so, if not, you should not wish it. And the whole subject, he believed, belongs to a much higher plane than that on which it is usually discussed. It is 15 years since I carefully studied Tennyson, and especially his In Memoriam. His arguments, however, seemed to me unconvincing though powerful. I came to prize the 2 volumes I had of Browning's selections, but could not give complete adhesion to his views either. My judgment was suspended with a leaning of the heart to the larger hope. George MacDonald did me great and growing service, though I could never accept all his conclusions nor admire greatly his logic. On the other hand, the logic of George Eliot's creed seemed to me faultless, and her sympathy with opposite views complete. And her rigid and faithful devotion to truth and fact alone seemed to me to be rewarded in her art. George MacDonald's creations as a rule seem ghostly abstractions. George Eliot's are alive, prick them and they bleed. But the melancholy which her books create is undeniable, and the heart instinctively revolts from her creed. Matthew Arnold did me immense service by his theological books, and opened the Bible for me again as a book of living interest. But his famous axiom that miracles do not happen, and his elimination of the supernatural element, are unmistakable. But a careful study of Isaiah, with the help of his notes, gave me a clue to a higher view, in my judgment, than the one he himself arrived at. He, too, deprecates the ascription of personality to God, and so does away with the impulse to pray. For who can pray to a stream of tendency? Here, again, however, the light which he throws upon the character and teaching of St. Paul helps one also to realize better the teaching of Paul himself, which is higher than that of the critic. Ruskin believed in these things, but his authority is weakened by the evangelical teaching which he himself in time discarded. The great masters seem to me inconclusive. The whole value of Dante's teaching is vitiated by his false and horrible presentations of eternal punishment. Shakespeare holds himself aloof from the subject, and his opinions do not lie on the surface. Goethe I believe to more explicitly teach the efficacy of prayer and individual immortality than he actually did. I had long had a slight knowledge of and much curiosity about Whitman, and 12 months before my mother died I read for the first time complete copies of Leaves of Grass and Specimen Days. And felt the deep thrill of contact with a mighty spirit. And it seemed a great thing that he, of all men, taught the doctrine of immortality with quite new emphasis and authority. The foregoing are only very crude and sketchy outlines of the intellectual gropings, questionings, studies and complex, many-sided experiences and difficulties of many years. But they will help you to partially understand my position at the time I write of. And now to my narrative. I will not trouble you with any particulars which do not seem to me necessary for my purpose. And these I will give as briefly as is consistent with the clearness and right coloring of the picture I want to present. I feel, however, that I must, at the outset, make a disclaimer. I do not want you to judge of my character as a son from my devotion to my mother on her deathbed. As a matter of fact I was never in the true sense, a good son. I have too many grave faults and strong opposing idiosyncrasies for that. And I have innumerable bitter memories of harshness, temper, selfish want of consideration and sympathy, things left undone that I ought to have done and things done that I ought to have left undone. They are past recall or expiation now, and I can only pray and strive for a better nature in future. It is perhaps hardly necessary to speak of my mother. She was not without faults or weaknesses either. She had good qualities in an exceptional degree that I need not analyze or speak of. But it is necessary for my purpose that I should refer to what was her ruling passion, a deep, constant, absorbing and self-sacrificing love for her only son. Every one knows something of the sacred depths of a mother's love. But very few can sound their profound abysses as it has been my lot to do. Many circumstances threw us more together than is usual. For one thing, my father was much from home. My own tastes and pursuits kept me more closely at home than is the case with most young men. Our natures, too, were similar in many ways. Naturally I was in many things my mother's confidant. Her sufferings and declining strength made her more and more dependent upon me and knit our hearts together more closely as time went on. She suffered excruciating pains at times. She became lame and lost the power to stand. If my father was at home he would carry her upstairs at night to bed, if not, she crept to the foot of the stairs and pulled herself up step by step. But on no account would she let me carry her, fearing that I might strain or hurt myself. But eventually she had to allow me, and after that I always carried her upstairs. She was always poorly in the morning and suffered great internal pain. I used to regularly take her up a cup of tea to breakfast, but she ate next to nothing. Some 18 months before she died she told me that she believed she suffered from an internal cancer. I had long urged her to let me call in a doctor, and I now insisted upon it. For a long time she would not allow it, but finally yielded, and Dr. R. was called in. She seemed more bright and cheerful after his visit. She told me that his verdict was that it was not a cancer, but the facts which led her to think it was were the results of her rheumatism. It was a happy relief to me, and I dismissed altogether the dreadful ideas which had weighed like lead upon my heart. As a matter of fact it was a cancer, and my mother soon came to know it without a shadow of doubt. But in her self-sacrificing regard for me she kept all knowledge back from me, and in the weary, painful and gloomy months that followed I lived in absolute ignorance of the real facts of the case. Perhaps it was better so. I really believe that if I had known, the dreadful knowledge would have killed me. As it was I was supported by groundless hopes. And even so, the pain of it and the daily strain on my heart and mind were almost more than I could bear, and their effects have remained with me ever since. I will say as little as possible of that time. I will only note her visibly declining strength, the solitude and many miseries of her lot, her absorbing and endless solicitude for me. Her complete indifference to self and her constant spirit of loving self-sacrifice and a love in both our hearts that grew more tender and profound as we realized more and more the coming and inevitable end. The countless heartaches and pains of those days only revealed more clearly the depth and strength of a love which was mightier than all adverse circumstances, even death itself. So the days and weeks and months dragged on in ever-deepening gloom, till the fateful month of January, 1885. As my mother's strength became less and less her time for going to bed grew earlier, from 10 to 9:30, to 9, to 8:30, to 8. It pained me excessively to note this, and every night after she had gone I felt unspeakably sad and wretched as I thought of the future. I could not bear to part with her. I used to keep her as long as possible, joke with her and do my best to cheer her as well as myself. But her weariness getting too great she would often lose patience and say, with pathetic entreaty, "Willie, do take me, why don't you take me?" Or, "Willie, do let me go." After that there was nothing for it but to take her at once. On the 9th of January, 1885, I went to a birthday party. I was far from well, and I had no heart for it, but I went to tea, came home at 8 to take my mother to bed, for the last time it turned out, and went back, not returning till between 1 and 2. During the night I was awakened by my mother knocking at the wall. She felt faint, she said, and asked me to bring her a glass of water. I asked if I should make tea, and she said she preferred water, which I got her. I grieve to say that I was altogether harsh, unsympathetic and ungracious. I ought to have known that she needed more, and without a moment's thought for myself should have got it. She thanked me with her usual tenderness and I went to bed again. Next morning when I took her tea it all came out. During the night she had crept out of bed and fainted on the floor. On recovery she had managed with much painful effort to get into bed again. She would not disturb or trouble me, knowing what she did, but felt compelled at last to rouse me and ask for a glass of water. Fancy it! Cold water! And rendered with unsympathetic grumbling at that. I have never forgiven myself for my far worse than stupidity and callousness. My mother, however, in her sweet, serene charity and loving kindness forgave me from the first. I will not go into details of the illness that followed. She did not get up that day, though serenely cheerful, hopeful and loving. My father came home in the afternoon and she seemed a little better, but at night grew worse and slightly delirious. Early next morning, Sunday, I brought the doctor, and I learned for the first time, what others knew, that she had been really suffering from cancer all the time and that recovery was impossible. Though the inevitable end might possibly be averted for a time. It was a horrible blow to me. I hunted up a nurse and was in constant attendance on her myself till the end came, 9 days after. On Sunday, Monday and Tuesday she continued to improve, and my heart grew lighter and more cheerful. Then she began to grow worse and went step by step down into the valley of the shadow. I will pass on rapidly to the closing scenes. But I must note first the following traits of my mother's behavior: an utter and complete forgetfulness of self, unfailing love and charity to all, serene cheerfulness and even gaiety. Exerting herself always to cheer me with bright and loving smiles and consoling, hopeful words. This, of course, only while she was able. At night she always grew delirious, of which, more anon. I am sorry to give you painful details, and I only do so where it is necessary for my ultimate purpose. But I am compelled to give you some details of closing scenes. The night but one before she died was the most horrible night I ever spent. As usual, in such wasting diseases, the waste of the body, after devastating the muscular system, attacks the nervous system. When this stage is reached, the patient enters on a period of horrible unrest and weariness, passionately longing for rest and incessantly and vainly seeking it by a change of position. Every night, in the delirium of her illness, she felt something of this weariness and would, at the close of the day, call on me, in the old familiar words, "Willie, do take me upstairs, do take me." On this particular night, similar cries rang in my ears the whole horrible night long: "Willie, do take me, do let me go, why don't you let me go?" The words pierced my heart. I knew that the rest she sought could only come in death, and my heart was hot in angry rebellion. I could not let her go. Fate was too much for me. But it was an unspeakable cruel fate, and every faculty in me rose in passionate protest and resentment. I changed her position again and again, adjusted and smoothed her pillow, and for a few brief moments she would lie quiet. Then again the old, incessant, heart-piercing cries: "Willie, do let me go, do take me, why don't you let me go?" And so, again and again, through the whole length of the horrible night. Next day she was quieter. The doctor said it was only a question of hours. In the afternoon she seemed utterly exhausted, and for a time we thought she was dying. My father, Mrs. D., the nurse, and I stood looking on in momentary expectation of the end. I was quite tired out, heart and body, sullen and resentful. It was of a piece with the whole horrible thing that she should die thus, without any sign or leave-taking. But it was not to be so, and she revived again. About 7 o'clock that night I was alone with her. She was unconscious. I kneeled at her bedside, my face down on the bed. My brain felt scorched and the whole thing a horrible nightmare. It was no longer my mother lying there but a ghastly automaton, I myself an automaton, both alike driven in a vast world machine, remorseless, brainless and heartless, crushing all before it. Later on, my father, coming upstairs, must have been alarmed about me and compelled me to go an errand, which he declared absolutely necessary. I think it probable that my going out for a short time saved my reason. Late at night my father drove me to bed. I refused. I could not go, or lose any of the precious time now left me with my mother, but I agreed ultimately to go for 2 hours at most, if he would rouse me sooner in case of change. Very reluctantly I went, but I was quite spent and I slept soundly till 6, my father letting me sleep on. I at once hastened to the room and stayed there till the end, about 1 o'clock. My mother was apparently the same, but weaker. She welcomed me with the sweet old smile, and responded always, as before, with loving kisses to mine. She was quite conscious but too weak to speak. The morning dragged on till noon, when I heard Mr. T. in the kitchen with my father. I asked her if she would like him to come up, and she nodded a pleased expression of her wish. He came and prayed at her bedside, my mother following it all with full appreciation, her head supported by my arm, shaking with the extreme palsy of coming death. She tried to express her thanks and followed him with grateful eyes as he left the room. Later, about 1 o'clock, my father and the nurse went downstairs. Mrs. D. remained, but I asked her to go, too, and leave me alone with my mother. I then asked Mother if she would like me to pray with her. I had never done so, but I fancied that she wished it, and she assented with evident satisfaction. Standing at the foot of the bed, I prayed briefly to God, our Father, to mercifully release my mother from her suffering and take her to himself and guide and help me in the lonely path that lay before me. I then turned away a minute or two to the window. Looking around, I saw instantly that the last change had come. I hastened to moisten her lips, but her tongue was rigid. I went to the top of the stair and called to my father. He hastened up and was just in time to catch the last futile attempt at breath. In an access of strong emotion I cried out, "Thanks be to God, that giveth us the victory," and it seemed to my excited fancy that my mother's spirit nodded assent. It seemed to me for the moment that I stood in the very presence of the infinite love and felt it through my being. I went downstairs and told Mrs. D. and the nurse that all was over, and they went upstairs to render the last sad offices. I came into this room, the room in which this paper was read, and gave myself up to a long, heavy fit of sobbing, however, no longer of grief, but of great relief. Recognition of the mighty comfort that had come into my heart and of resigned and loving farewell. During the days that followed and until after the funeral I felt a great calm and peace of mind and heart, a peace of mind which I venture to say was no other than the peace of God that passeth all understanding. It passed away, but the memory of it remained. Grief and the sense of irrecoverable loss had their natural course, and I spent many weeks of sleeplessness and tears. I have no hope that my words will convey more than a poor fraction of the real facts. At best I can only sketch these in rudest outline. But I will ask you to consider a few of the most prominent in the narrative I have given you. Remember what I have said of the spiritual questionings of many years and their results. Consider how my mother's long and frightful suffering revealed and strengthened as nothing else could, not only the sweet and lovable qualities of her heart and mind and the strength of the hope and faith which sustained her through it all, but also the length and breadth and depth of her wonderful self-sacrificing love for me, which grew only stronger, deeper and more tender as she advanced further into the shadow of our inevitable parting. And when the last stroke fell upon her and she was confined to her bed never to rise again, think how grateful and sweet to me were those days of slight improvement, when I was privileged to attend her constantly and show her, as I never could before, the reality and depth of my responding love and receive her entire forgiveness for all the thoughtlessness and wrongdoing of the past and her heartfelt blessing. And hastening on to the closing scene, think of the horrible night, when her incessant cries rang out to me to let her go, and I knew that it meant let her go to the last rest of death. And my heart stood out in passionate resentment and protest against a cruel and merciless fate. Think of that scene next day, when her strength seemed gone and we watched for the end, and I felt, with sullen resentment, that it was only of a piece with all the rest that she should die thus, without any sign or leave-taking. In the presence of comparative aliens, not of her own household, while I, her son, born of her body, bone of her bone and flesh of her flesh, the one person whom she loved with all the mighty love of her great heart, stood as an outsider beyond her consciousness. Think of the hour that evening when, with scorched brain, I felt through and through my being the dreadful significance of the materialistic creed, that we were mere automatic parts of a vast machine, brainless, heartless, merciless and cruel. Think of the providence by which restoring and healing sleep was granted me to make me capable of a truer vision. Think of the tender grace of our next morning's communion, my mother's full consciousness and the sweet tokens of her undying love. Think of the providence which led Mr. T. to come within an hour of the end and offer up solemn prayer, in which my mother could join with full appreciation in company with my father and myself. Think of the fitness of the arrangement by which, at the last moment, my mother and I were left alone, as she would have wished. Think of the divine training by which my rebellious heart was bowed into acquiescence and resignation. Think of the course by which my antagonism and skepticism were laid low, and I was led, with my mother's pleased concurrence, at last to let her go, and to call audibly on the divine Father of all to take her to himself. And think how immediately the prayer was answered and God revealed himself to me, and I felt through all my being, in the moment of her death, the presence of the infinite love, the divine Comforter, soothing me with a strange and ineffable peace. Human words are poor instruments for the expression of such realities. But beyond the touch of all possible argument, despite the apparent experiences of my life since and my backslidings, I knew that a divine providence was at work in my hour of utmost need, summing up the long gropings and processes of the past. And despite all earthly darknesses and sin, illumining all my future course with an infinite hope. I no longer trouble myself with the difficulties raised by metaphysics and philosophy about the personality of God, for, however that may be, I know that there is that in him to which I may address myself as to a loving friend and father. I no longer trouble myself with the discussions about God's providence and the contrary evidences of life and experiences, for I have seen his providence visibly at work, summing up in a crowning experience the processes of long years. In events which were entirely natural in their order and course, but were also visibly supernatural and miraculous, too. I no longer trouble myself with doubts about God's love, and the contrary evidences furnished by the world's sin and endless miseries, for in the midst of the heaviest grief of my own life I have seen an ineffable tenderness and love revealed, which crowned and justified the sufferings which preceded it, and illumined much that lay dark and mysterious in the past. However this poor outline may strike you, I know that the actual facts were more fit and beautiful than any earthly poet could have conceived in his most gracious and tender mood. I no longer trouble myself with the current discussions about immortality, for I know that my mother is secure and that all is well with her, for, unworthy as I am, I have myself seen the ineffable glory of the love which received her when she was taken from me. Summary. J.W.'s narrative makes it quite clear that he had the earnestness of mind and desire for spiritual growth which, as we have seen, seem to be prerequisites to illumination. B. His age, upon the occurrence of this last, was 31½ years. C. There was no experience of subjective light. D. Intellectual illumination was well marked. E. And moral exaltation still more so. F. Although he does not give details, perhaps could not do so, it is clear that he experienced something very near akin to the cosmic vision, if he did not even see the Brahmic splendor itself. G. The peace and knowledge, spoken of by Whitman and referred to by all the cases as one of the chief results of the attainment of nirvana, the cosmic sense, came to J.W. unmistakably, instantaneously. H. The strict parallelism of this case with all the others given will be recognized by every careful reader. XXXII, case of J. William Lloyd, in his own words. You ask for a brief statement of my life and spiritual evolution. I was born in Westfield, N.J., June 4, 1857. My parents were English, and had had but a few months' schooling apiece. My father was a carpenter, my mother a seamstress. My mother was a woman of broad, gentle nature, spiritual, poetic, a great reader. My father was an intense abolitionist. My schooling was scant, at a district school. We lived near a great wood. I cared not much for other children, but spent my time with books and the trees. I loved the trees like conscious friends. The disagreeable side of religion was never shown me. I talked with God when an infant as naturally as with my mother. Some old book on philosophy, I do not know its name, fell into my hands, and I commenced to think to the core. I read the Bible, commentaries, a book on all religions. At 13 I was atheist, then turned quickly, experienced conversion, and, as I read, became Calvinist, Arminian, Swedenborgian. At 15 I was apprenticed to a carpenter, but work failed in 1873, and I became a gardener. At 17 I was a leader in prayer meetings, an exhorter, a disputant with ministers on points of orthodoxy. At 18 I went to Trails Hygienic College at Florence, N.J., as a working student. All radical questions met me here, and the woman who became my wife. Trail died, the college failed, I went to Kansas as a pioneer, was a herder, a homesteader, married in 1879, acted as hygienic physician for my neighbors, read the Boston Index and Theodore Parker. and became a member of the Free Religious Association. 3 years' drought drove me from Kansas to a sanitarium in Vinton, Iowa, where I was assistant. Became agnostic. Read Ingersoll and the Scientists. Joined a hygienic colony in Tennessee in January 1883. Again a pioneer in the woods. Accepted Carl Haingen's Democracy, and grew more confirmed in writing poems, which I had first commenced just before going to Kansas. Accepted Free Love, which I had fought for years. Colony failed, and I went to another similar one in Florida, many spiritualists here. Read Tucker's Liberty, and became an enthusiastic anarchist. Orange grower, farm laborer and pioneer. Colony and work failed, and went to Palatka. Poultry farmer. Wife died in September 1888, after nearly a decade of most happy married life. Came north to old home, with 2 little children, and became a professional nurse. Here found more books, and read the poets, Emerson, Whitman, Thoreau, Spencer, Darwin, Carpenter, William Morris. I loved the transcendentalists, but did not understand them very well. I lived mostly in poetry and sociologic science. As to my illumination, I was going to New York City one morning in January 1897, on a train, to do some hospital work. I was reading Carpenter. It was a beautiful winter morning. I think I was near the Bay Bridge, or on it, when the thought came. There was no particular sensation, except that something beautiful and great seemed to have happened me, which I could only describe in terms of light. Yet it was purely mental. But everything looked different to me. I went about the city that day calm, but glad and uplifted. The thing I remember most was a wonder how soon the sensation, or impression, would leave me. I was latently skeptical, and thought it a temporary inspiration, like that of a poem. But days, weeks, months, passed, and I found the shoot which had broken ground that winter morning was ever growing, strengthening and changing all the scenery of my life. I continually questioned and tested, and at last, after a year's trial, began to write. All the early part of the book was written at night, while I nursed and guarded a lunatic boy, whose yells, laughs, curses and filthy jests made the room ring as I wrote. Yet I wrote easily, swiftly, without any conscious cerebration, and with a sort of wonder at the words I wrote, as if they had no connection with me. Part of the book was written in the following summer, when at home, part of it in the winter of 1899 to 1900, while getting ready for the press, but always with the same sensations of ease and inspiration. And still, when I read the book, it seemed to me something apart, in whose construction I had had no hand. As to how I felt when I received the thought, you have yourself most accurately described the symptoms on pages 10 and 11 of your pamphlet. With the intellectual illumination comes an indescribable moral elevation. An intense and exalted joyfulness, and, along with this, a sense of immortality. Not merely a belief in a future life, that would be a small matter, but a consciousness that the life now being lived is eternal, death being seen as a trivial incident which does not affect its continuity. Further, there are annihilation of the sense of sin and an intellectual competency not simply surpassing the old, but on a new and higher plane. Also many of the marks of arahatship, as taught by Buddha, describe accurately the feeling. What proves J. William Lloyd to be a case of cosmic consciousness is not so much the above account of himself, although that could hardly have been written without some such an experience as illumination, as the volume, 110a, which he produced after the occurrence in question. This volume, which contains overwhelming evidence of the fact, is easily accessible and will doubtless be read by every person who feels an interest in the subject. The oncoming of cosmic consciousness in this case was very similar to the same fact in the case of Edward Carpenter. There was a clearly marked moment when the light began to break through, but illumination came gradually. There was no subjective light. There was well-marked intellectual illumination and moral elevation, but the cosmic vision, the Brahmic splendor, of the great cases does not appear to have been present. If not, this cannot be said to be a complete case, and still J. William Lloyd's book shows a most excellent insight into the cosmic order. It must be remembered that illumination that comes gradually may be as complete as that which comes instantly. Why there should be such difference in the awakening in different cases cannot at present be explained. As far as our facts will carry us, it would appear that the cases in which the cosmic sense makes its appearance full-grown, instantly and, as it were, in a flash, are those in which there is marked subjective light, such cases as that of Dante, Yepes, Paul, Pascal and others. When, on the contrary, the new sense comes more gradually, there may be no subjective light, as in the cases of Carpenter and Lloyd. It seems tolerably certain that with illumination there occurs actual, physical, molecular rearrangement somewhere in the cerebral centers, and that it is this molecular rearrangement which, when considerable and sudden, gives rise to the phenomenon of the subjective light. 33. Horace Traubel was born December 19, 1858, and was therefore in his 31st year at time of his first illumination. His experience is here given in his own words. It is all of it full of interest, but perhaps the most significant thing about it is the manner the intelligence of it was received by Walt Whitman, whose matter-of-fact, simple words, "I knew it would come to you," carry a depth of meaning quite out of the common. H.T. tells the story of his awakening in this colloquial and direct way, in answer to the inquiries of the editor. You are quite familiar with the path of my spiritual development, with the course taken by my mental self in arriving at its present state. You know I have come to my own, whatever that may be, mostly by immediate contact with experience rather than through books, though I have read in books of the most miscellaneous character and at one period in appalling numbers. But, somehow, the scholar in me never seems to have obscured the man. I suppose my intenser early reading was in Emerson, Carlyle, Hugo and whatever else I could get hold of having to do with the world of myth and the anti-Christian scriptures of the race. I do not seem to have known a time when I have not read Leaves of Grass. But previous to May, 1889, I do not seem to have got that, in a sense, final grasp of its mystery which now imparts to it its primary and supernatural significance. May, 1889. Then, again, 2 years later, 1891. A third time, 1893 or 4, on the historic night, historic to me, when circumstance made me the spokesman of the dissentient group of ethicists in Philadelphia, on the occasion of the split of the Ethical Society there. May, 1889. That overwhelming night, as I leaned over the railing of the ferryboat, lost this world for another, and in the anguish and joy of a few minutes saw things heretofore withheld from me revealed. Those who have had such an encounter will understand what this means, others will not, or will perhaps only realize it by intimation. I could not separate the physical and spiritual of that moment. My physical body went through the experience of a disappearance in spiritual light. All severe lines in the front of phenomena relaxed. I was one with God, love, the universe, arrived at last face to face with myself. I was sensible of peculiar moral and mental disturbances and readjustments. There was an immediateness to it all, an indissoluble unity of the several energies of my being in one force. I was no more boating it on a river than winging it in space or taking star leaps, a traveler from one to another on the peopled orbs. While I stood there the boat had got into the slip and was almost ready to go out again. A deckhand who knew me came up and tapped me on the shoulder. "Don't you intend going off the boat?" he asked. And he added when I faced him and said, "Yes, you look wonderfully well and happy tonight, Mr. Traubel." I did not see Walt till the next day, evening. In the meantime I had lived through 24 hours of ecstasy mixed with some doubts as to whether I had not had a crack in the skull and gone mad rather than fallen under some light and made a discovery. But the first words Walt addressed to me when I sallied into his room were reassuring. "Horace, you have the look of great happiness on your face tonight. Have you had a run of good luck?" I sat down and tried in a few words to indicate that I had had a run of good luck, though not perhaps the good luck he had in mind for me at the moment. He did not seem at all surprised at what I told him, merely remarking, as he put his hand on my shoulder and looked into my eyes, "I knew it would come to you." I suggested, "I have been wondering all day if I am not crazy." He laughed gravely, "No, sane. Now at last you are sane. It was a month before the immediate effect of this experience wore off. The reflex effect was of course fixed. I can say now, writing 1901, that from that day to this I have never known one moment of despair concerning my spiritual relations to man and the universe. I have my earth troubles and my earth foibles. But the essential faith is adamantine. I have never had any suspicion of immortality. The glimpse of that minute, and of the repeated experiences on the two after occasions mentioned above, into the eternal law left no blot or qualification. I had often said before, in speaking of Whitman, making in a way a true guess, Whitman's notion of immortality is not one of logic but is pictorial. He does not believe in immortality. He sees it. Many times Whitman had said to me regarding that explanation, "It is every word true. You hit the nail on the head." Now I knew better than I had before, not only better but in a way I could not have known before, what I myself meant when I used the expression, Whitman sees. I see around and through phenomena. Phenomena is never a wall or a veil. I have been able to do my work as never before. It has brought me friends and the cheer of sympathetic greetings from all parts of the world. One feature of my writing I ought to mention. I think I told you long ago that I become in effect automatic when I am engaged in any serious composition. I do not seem to write. The writing seems done through me. I take up my pen and hardly know what I write. After I have written I am often surprised at the things I have said. They are as new to me as to any reader. All the writing which has brought me any returns, congratulations, has been done in that mood. On the night of the ethical split I was in a position which forced me to be the main spokesman of the party of freedom. I made a speech upon which my enemies even more than my friends congratulated me. Yet when I got on my feet on the floor and plunged into talk I was instantly immersed in the strange light which had visited me on the first experience and simply uttered without thought or reason, formally speaking, the words of the mightier power that possessed me. I have found since that on occasions of crisis I have merely to throw myself back again on this resource to discover that every strength, spiritually speaking, it imparted once it imparts again. In my very busy life, which has its temporal distresses, this is more than a balance in bank and contributes more than any ephemera of material prosperity could towards my victories, in fact is the first and last letter of my power. When the little affairs of every day seem most mixed up, most to be past solution, I am sure finally to make my escape by the avenue of these ameliorating revelations. Not once has the Spirit deserted me, not once has the light, in some degree of its radiance, not always of course in full power, failed to appear. The difference it makes in one's life is the difference between preparation and consummation. On the occasion of my second experience, April, 1891, which was not outwardly momentous, I found that my initial self-suspicion, my question, am I unbuilt or built, did not reappear. If you take my verse, Illumination, and a great deal of H.T.'s verse and prose written since that year, and try to get it statistically languaged, you will find that I have expressed a series of experiences of profound significance to all who have been similarly blessed. I find that my members are no longer at war with each other. When I was a youngster I read my way vigorously and sympathetically back especially into Oriental literature of the religious class blazed a path for the spirit. After 1889, a hiatus in such reading having intervened, I found myself driven into that old world again, to review these my original impressions. The new light had made my voyage easier and more richly endowed its fruits. Once I felt that religions were all of them religions of despair, now I saw that no religion despairs, that all religion before it becomes and as soon as it ceases to be an affair of institutions resolves itself essentially into light and immortality. I should perhaps say that it has invariably happened that someone, and sometimes many persons, have commented to me, and felicitated me, upon my appearance, upon the occasions of my direct contact with what I have grown to call my subliminal self. This may mean much or nothing. But no one could live through what I do at such periods and not in some way outwardly give it witness. You have said to me, state this thing in plain prose. But how can I? I could never state it in the prose that would be understood by one who has not shared my sensations. I could never state it in words which would not make it, if you please, prose to those who can enter collaterally into the channels of its august revelation. After asking you, how can I? I have shown you how I could. Some things I have said may seem to savor of egotism. But they are simply candid. I am not measuring myself as a genius or an idiot, but as a simple third person whose word and career must be to himself absolute law. I have written you this memorandum impulsively, with no attempt to dress it up, if, indeed, until now it is done, and now I have read it, with any actual understanding of what my pen would commit me to or confess. The following poem was written by Horace Traubel shortly after his illumination and of course strictly belongs here. The nights, the days, hold me in thrall. Toils of men and women drag my faith to the earth. Furrowed with pain, the casual cares. I long, I look, I reach forth to life. Release. Escape. Shall I speak of the door swung wide, of the unbarred gates? After the vigil I step across the borderline. I take my place with the pioneers. Have I met the hour patiently, without fear, at the portal? Now is my name called, now the lip of my love has spoken. Do I mistake you, O divine signaler? Is it after all some other soul that is hailed? Myself is my answer. There's that in my heart responds, meeting the call with equal voice, establishing forever the unspeakable bond. Bond that does not bind, bond that frees, bond that discovers and bestows. Look. I am flushed with inexhaustible possessions. The old measures vanish, I am expanded to infinite sweep. O world! Not dead to you, only seeing you, knowing you, at last. Mixed with countless worlds, knowing with you your companions also. O year! Not dead to you, only seeing you, knowing you, at last. Mixed with all time, untangling the knotted thread. O world! O year! Before birth seeing birth, after life seeing life. The infinite blue, heaven's fond eye, opens upon me. O voice, mastering me, making me too master. My ear is close, I hear the syllables fall. Waves on shores of the farther worlds, waves on shores of the day. The clouds part, O face, O face, O face. Face smiling upon me, smiling me wings, buoyant beyond the discarded cheapened present. You, too, O present, still remaining. Duly visiting my heart, not forbidden. Yet yielding the place supreme. I am all I, O God. You are all speech. Melody celestial, sight and voice, color and tone, warring no more. In the boundless blue uplifted. Whose hand touches me, my brow, my breast, my own unasking hand. Leading me out of self to self. Divine form, mother, father, sex only now standing revealed, the union irreversible. Divine form, I made whole in you. The elements diverse here blended. This minute grown infinite, the far world spread before me. The endless drift of soul, the long stretch of faces, all lit by the divine sun. Or swift or slow or early or late the line not anywhere broken. All, equally sustained. Swept in the same destiny, on sea and land of life. The peak lit for all, the triumph inevitable. O my soul! Look yet again. There too are you, a figure in the panorama. On your brow the dawn has set its beauteous beam. Here with me, there not with me. Death fills me with its abundance. What is this flood, overcoming body and sense? I feel the walls of my skull crack, the barriers part, the sun flood enter. Love, lore, not lost, only magnified, floating eternal seas of essence. Before and behind births and deaths, spiritual gravitation, the emergence evermore expanding. O soul, have I lost you or found you? Found. The faultless circle born at last to you. After the waiting years. Far eras behind, far eras ahead, the simple few years I finger. Shafts from the central sun. Speeding for fuller fruition the orbs of space. Back to the first word of speech. On to the last utterance of seers. My soul, knowing its own, wrapped in its protean habit, catches the perfect song. God. I am circled, I am drunk with the influx of life. Wheeled in your orbit, given the word I would speak yet must withhold. Leaving you, O my brother, each one, to say it for yourself. Brothers, worlds, I greet you. The wheel turns, the boundless prospect opens. All complicate, the light bearing limitlessly the burdens of all. Do you think that you are missed, that the large heart beats not for you? That somewhere on the road you must faint and die? Strength will be given for all your need. And the weakest, when the night comes which is the day, will greet the king, a giant in stature and grace. Now the immortal years, the ceaseless round realized. The doubts shorn of wing and foot. The farthest league nearest, and the multiplied infinities choking here in my breast. O my questioner! You do not suspect me, you suspect yourself. Tomorrow, seeing yourself, you will see me. And the illumined spirit, passing the portal. God grown, will hail me proudly, XXIX, 40. Had we no other writings by this man, these lines alone to all who can understand them, and they are as clear as day from the point of view of this volume, would be proof of illumination. But we have much else. A series of writings in prose and verse extending over the last 10 years gives us more evidence than is needed. Then there is something else to say. Horace Traubel, as he intimates himself in his own words, above, belongs with Blake, Yepes, Behmen, Swedenborg and others, in the class of what may be called automatic writers. These men give their inspiration free way, they drop the reins on his neck and let the horse go. What they write under the divine impulse, for those who can follow their thought, is divine, but to those who cannot, is, as Paul says, just in this connection, foolishness. Perhaps all these men write automatically, but, in the case of some of them, the expression as it flows from the cosmic sense, or as afterwards modified by the self-conscious intellect, is more intelligible to the natural man than in the case of others. In not one of them does the meaning lie on the surface, they all call for and demand long-continued and thoughtful reading. Whitman and Paul are just as unintelligible as Behmen or Swedenborg, until the right point of view is reached, although Whitman, for his part, wrought his whole life, returning upon his poems, lingering long, in order to render them absorbable by the race. Horace Traubel has not escaped the curse of his tribe, unintelligibility. But in spite of it he has produced his effect. And this is the strangest thing of all, that it should be possible for a man to speak or write what cannot be understood, but to do it in such a divine way that his words shall be revered and remembered through the ages. The Shakespeare sonnets have never been understood, and are yet accepted for what they really are, a revelation. Horace Traubel has many readers who understand him, and even those who do not comprehend him fully are impressed by his personality, through which streams unmistakably the divine light. XXXIV. The case of Paul Tyner, in his own words. I was born March 7, 1860, about midnight, in the city of Cork, Ireland. My mother being Irish, of an old family, the Sarfields, one of whom is celebrated by Macaulay in his account of the conflict in Ireland between the Stuart forces and those under William of Orange. My father was the representative in Ireland of an important London publishing house. He used to say that one of his ancestors fought under William of Orange, and I believe came over with him from Holland. I was brought to America at the age of 4, educated in the public schools of Albany, N.Y. Afterwards taking the law course in Columbia College, New York City, but exchanging law for journalism at the age of 20, when I joined the staff of the New York World, in which service I remained about 8 years, uninterruptedly. In 1887 I went to Central America, to engage in silver mining, exploration and travel. After a year in Honduras, I went to Costa Rica, where I edited and published a daily paper, called El Comercio, in English and Spanish, for about 6 months, when I returned to New York and re-engaged in journalistic work there. As editorial writer on the staff of the New York Press. The bent of my mind in the direction of mysticism, which has so largely influenced my later work, probably had its beginnings during a year's retirement in the Shaker community, at Lebanon, N.Y., 1891-2. This experience was followed by a special course of study in social economics and history with Professor Richard T. Healy, of the University of Wisconsin. In the early morning of the 11th of May, 1895, came the crowning experience of my life. On the evening of that day I set down in my diary an exact and full account of the whole episode, as then seen by me. This memorandum I here transcribe. With this day's dawn come the great revelation and the great charge. Crowned with thorns was the waking thought. Then buffeted and spat upon, mocked, insulted, scourged and in the pillory, a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief, nailed to the cross, pierced in the side, utterly despised and rejected of men, killed as a malefactor, buried. And then the great thought, the truth which mocketh free. The absolute demonstration of man's mastery of fate and command of all conditions, the victory of man, all men in this racial man, this elder brother of mankind in his triumph over sin, fear and death. But one thing had remained in my mind as necessary to prove to the mass of men today man's absolute supremacy over death in all its forms as an attribute of his oneness with God, with eternal life, perfect love, perfect justice. Omniscience and omnipotence, the visible appearance of a man who living longer than the recorded years of any man who had seen death still lived in the flesh without shadow of change or decay. And I said to myself, this would be worth waiting and watching and working 1,000 years for. Yet I wished the greater emancipation were not so far off. And lo! In the dawning of this day I know absolutely as a fact, a truth nothing can destroy, that the man who triumphed ever death on Calvary nearly 2,000 years ago lives on earth in a body of flesh made perfect, a man among men. Sharing our struggles and sorrows, our joys and griefs, working with us heart to heart and shoulder to shoulder, inspiring, guiding, leading, supporting, as may be, in every human advance. The glory of this truth, the grandeur of this character, the supreme nobility, patience, wisdom and love of this life, thrilled me with ecstasy in awe unspeakable, filled me, possessed me. He lives, not in some distant heaven on a great white throne, but here and now, is not coming, but is here with us, loving, helping, living, cheering and inspiring the race to which he belongs, as wholly and as truly as the race belongs to him. Now, indeed, it is plain, that being lifted up he shall lift all men with him, has lifted, is lifting and must ever continue to lift out of the very essence of his transcendent humanity. Immortality is no longer an hypothesis of the theologian, a figment of the imagination, a dream of the poet. Men shall live forever, because man, invincible to all effects of time and change, and even of murderous violence, lives today in the fullness of life and power that he enjoyed in his 33rd year. With only added glory of goodness and greatness and beauty, although the world counts 1895 years since his last birth upon this earth. This is the truth given age upon age to all men in all lands, and persistently misunderstood, the truth at last to be seen of all men in its fullness and purity. Man is to know himself, and with full command of his conditions and unlimited time for action, is not only to soar toward, but absolutely attain to heights of being and of beauty hitherto undreamed of. And bringing fairly within his realization a heaven on earth, in true grandeur and happiness as far transcending the heaven of the orthodox Christian as that heaven transcends the heaven of the savage. This is the fact I am given to know, the proof must come in good time. My mission is to bear witness to it, to be the voice crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord. Make straight his paths. And in the light of this truth I live anew, I rise up vitalized and energized in every nerve and fiber. Soul and body, no longer strained apart, are linked and glorified. I will be worthy of the great charge of truth-bearer to my kind, and will manifest in my body, in my thought and words, my life and actions, the truth that has become part of me, the truth of man's oneness with eternal life. With these thoughts filling me and dissolving me in happy tears, I sprang from my bed about 5 o'clock and walked up and down the room in a fervor of adoration and love, for what love is like unto this man's. All this time the atmosphere of the room was vibrant with an intense white light. The presence which had been revealed in the first waking moments seemed now diffused and continuing through the universe. After bathing and dressing I went out for an early walk. The morning was chilly, cloudy, raw and gusty, but the sweet-scented, light-filled air, full of vivid, tender green of spring and vibrant with life, seemed to share my sensation of joy and uplift. I may add, that my mind, being naturally analytical, I have been able to trace as distinct factors in the mental evolution here indicated, first, and perhaps most of all, Wagner's Lohengrin and Parsifal, second, the Venus of Milo. Third, Munkacs's Christ before Pilate, all of them, however, blended, expanded and illumined by the grand soul of Walt Whitman. In reply to your question, I do not know whether any change in my physical appearance followed what may be called my illumination and would rather someone else would speak of that. I have been told, however, that my face was that of one aflame, and that is distinctly my own feeling as to the change physically. There is a consciousness of a steady glow which is light and warmth in all my being. It is certain that ever since that morning I have had a larger and surer hold on life and have been able to work with clearer and more active brain and body. Being asked to explain more fully the continuous life of Christ on earth in a human body, Paul Tyner answered as follows. In asserting the continued existence on earth of the man Jesus, in the body of flesh and blood. It is by no means intended to deny the law demonstrated throughout the universe in all forms of life, simple or complex, of the passage from birth to maturity, and maturity to decay, so far as outer form is concerned. What this continued existence of Jesus in a body of flesh and blood means is dominion and control over the law of construction, destruction and reconstruction going on in all forms, its deliberate and conscious direction at all times. As a matter of fact, flexibility is the very essence of form, and this is especially true in regard to the human form. The spirit, which is the man himself, formless and unsubstantial, is continually building and rebuilding, calling to himself out of the universal ocean of matter and force all the elements he needs. And rejecting and expelling that which he has used, when it no longer serves his purpose, or when he has taken from it all that he requires. In the true sense, there is no such thing as disembodied spirit. Spirit must embody itself for manifestation and expression. Jesus, having attained to spiritual self-consciousness, deliberately and consciously chose and chooses his embodiment, molding it from day to day, into greater and greater responsiveness to his will, in his case the cosmic will. The will of the Father. He is able to pass through closed doors and stone walls in this body, because of his power to change its vibrations. That is to say, he passes through stone walls, as ethers or gases pass through substances of lower vibrations or greater density. The component elements of his body, while governed to some extent by normal human anatomical structure and organization, is in what might be called a state of flux. The old Greeks considered the universe in a state of flux, as indeed it is. Fully aware, as I am, of the difficulties in the way of describing a phenomenon, not merely unfamiliar, but unthinkable by most men. I can only ask the reader who desires a keener comprehension of what is meant by this immortalization of the flesh, to imagine by way of analogy. And yet an analogy conveying a very close approximate to the actuality, to imagine an architect who has planned a very beautiful and perfect dwelling, whose mind holds the plan very distinctly and completely, and who is himself a master builder. With unlimited command of the materials needed to embody his plan, and unerring knowledge of the best method of building. Imagine, further, that this architect, standing in the midst of the dwelling he has planned and built, should find that the materials he used, by some chance, or rather law, burned up every night without, however, burning him, or in the least injuring his powers. Remember that the plan remains intact. Remember that the builder's skill is not consumed. That his command of material, sufficient to his needs and instantaneous in supply, remains with him. What would happen? He would reproduce this dwelling as quickly as it was destroyed. In fact, there would be no apparent break in the continuity of the dwelling. The only possible changes would be that, with experience and growth, the material part of the building would become ever finer and finer, the adjustments of its various parts one to another more and more exact. This, in a rough way, conveys an idea of what is meant by the immortal man in an immortal embodiment. No difficulty appears to be found in conceiving of the immortal principle in man embodying itself in a succession of bodies, on an ascending or descending scale. Any more than we find it difficult to conceive of the universal principle of life embodying itself in a variety of forms in an ascending or descending scale. And yet, any such process must be considered complex and uncertain, compared to the simple and definite processes of the cosmically conscious man consciously and deliberately rebuilding, from day to day, that embodiment which best expresses his thought and answers to his requirements. In this, as in other things, evolution of forms and of processes are all in the direction of increased simplicity, of economy and efficiency in the doing of our work. It is not the personal Jesus that is immortalized, or that has the power of immortalizing the flesh, but the Christ principle clothed in that personality, embodied in it and using it simply as one of its modes of motion, so to speak. The Christ in Jesus, however, came into such fullness and plainness of manifestation that his personality is indeed made the light of the world that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. As regards the appearance of Paul Tyner at the time of illumination, I am informed by H.C. as follows: I am in a position to give a positive statement as to the appearance of Mr. Paul Tyner on the morning of the 11th of May, 1895. His color was unaltered, his flesh warm and natural, his expression peculiarly sweet and bright. His face had at the time and retained for days afterwards, the illuminated look we see at times on the face of the dying, a look of ecstasy, bright, uplifted, it was as if lit up with a glow from some unseen source. No lapse of the ordinary faculties, no failure of full health, both mental and bodily, but on the contrary apparently superabundant health. His day's work, a very large one, was done that day as usual. It only remains to quote two short passages from a book written and published before Paul Tyner had ever heard of the present editor or his theories. At daybreak of Friday, the 11th of May, 1895. I woke into full and absolute knowledge of the great fact which to me proves man's immortality here and now, and in the body of flesh we know. I know that a man had lived nearly 1900 years, and, knowing only fuller and fuller life with the passing of the years, had lived and still lives in the same body in which, in the beginning of that period, he walked the earth, a man of flesh and blood. This man, in whom humanity came to full flower with the conscious manifestation of his oneness with eternal life in the 33rd year of his present incarnation, has really destroyed the last enemy, which is death. Today, in Europe and America, Australia and Africa, India and the Isles of the Sea, wherever the Father is worshipped in spirit and in truth, as in the Judea of Herod the Great, Jesus the Christ, Son of God and Son of Man, lives in the midst of us. For this cause came he into the world, that he might be a witness to the truth. A living, unimpeachable witness of the truth that shall make us free, the truth of man's religion, reunion, with God, through absolute spiritual self-consciousness, with God, with the eternal, omnipotent and omniscient source and fountain of life, in whom we live and move and have our being, without whom we are not. I have said I knew this greatest fact in the history of humanity in a moment. That what before was as unknown to me as was the western continent to Columbus before he sighted land, became in an instant a known reality, as much a part of my consciousness as was the air I breathed. A truth as yet faintly comprehended in its fullness, but a truth firmly grasped, irrevocable and indestructible. An eternal verity written in the letters of fire on my brain and in my heart, and so on the mind and in the heart of this age, and of all future ages. Opening my eyes on the first rays of morning light illuminating my room, I thought of the oneness of eternal light and life in a vague way, when my attention was seemingly diverted by the image of a monk's tonsured head. And I thought of the crown of thorns it symbolized. Then the whole sublime tragedy of the Passion moved vividly and rapidly before my eyes. The scourging, the pillory, the cuffs and blows, the jibes and jeers, the mockery and derision of that crowning with thorns, the painful progress of Golgotha, hooted by the blind and cruel mob. The torture and ignominy of the nailing to the cross, the cry of agony telling that the last dregs of the cup had been drained, the shout of victory that proclaimed, "It is finished." I saw then the spear thrust. I saw the burial, the sublime temple of the divine thus laid low, and I saw, the resurrection on the third day. At this point my mind opened to the great fact, as to a flood of life. He rose from the dead. He never died again. He lives. The air in my room seemed to vibrate with a more intense light than was ever seen on land or sea. My brain and nerves, my blood and muscles, all my being vibrated in sympathetic unison with this light, and in the midst of its shining glory I beheld the divine man, the undying man, beheld him face to face. And knew that it was he in very flesh and bones, as in flesh transcending soul. Knew that it was he and not another. 187, 4. Verily, verily, I say unto you that he that believeth on me hath everlasting life. John 6, 47. In these words Jesus announced a scientific principle of the utmost importance. Belief is essential to the attainment of immortality, in or out of the body. Belief in what? Belief in immortality, a state of consciousness of the fact of immortality. Belief in Jesus, in any real sense, is belief in the immortality of man. It is a belief in him who is, the way, the truth and the life, in body and soul together, and with belief, a realization of oneness with him. 187:97, 8. I offer no criticism of the specific belief of Paul Tyner as to the living Christ. It is simply a question as to how the words are understood. Christ, as Paul named the cosmic sense, is of course living and will always live. From the point of view of this present book, Paul Tyner is almost a typical case of cosmic consciousness. A. The subjective light was well marked. B. There was the characteristic moral elevation. C. Also the usual intellectual illumination. D. The sense of immortality. E. The suddenness of the onset, the instantaneousness of the awakening. F. The previous mental life of the man was such as is likely to lead to illumination. G. His age of illumination, 35 years and 2 months. H. He attained cosmic consciousness in the spring, 11th of May. I. There was the characteristic change in appearance upon illumination. XXXV. The case of C.Y.E., in her own words. I was born April 21, 1864. I was brought up a member of the Church of England, accepted its teaching and loved its services and liturgy. I believed in Christ as God incarnate, the Word made flesh. The doctrine of the atonement, taken in the sense of a sacrifice necessary to appease the anger of an avenging God, had long been rejected by me. I was married on January 1, 1891. My husband possessed an intense and earnest desire for truth. He was an agnostic. Our common ground was a firm conviction that God is love, that he is also light and that in him is no darkness at all. 2 years after our marriage my husband became an enthusiastic and ardent admirer of the writings of Walt Whitman, and here, to my sorrow, I was left behind. I tried to read Leaves of Grass, but could not understand a word of it. I could hear the music of the verse, but the language in which it was written was to me an unknown tongue. I recognized that there was something, and perhaps something beyond the common, in this man's writing, but I was simply unable to see what it was. In the autumn of 1893 we moved into the country and settled in a little village in Yorkshire. Soon afterwards my husband went to Bolton to meet the Eagle College men there. He returned home delighted with the new comrades he had found, with the hearty love and good fellowship with which he had been received, at the indisputable evidence of the powerful magnetism of the man Walt Whitman, who could draw together men of all sorts, diverse in country, calling, habits, station, indeed in everything but this wonderful sense of comradeship. I became still more mystified. Then in September, 1894, a remarkable young Philadelphian, named P.D., who was deeply imbued with Whitman's philosophy, visited us. On Monday and again on Tuesday evening P.D. My husband and myself had long talks about Whitman and his teaching. On the afternoon of Wednesday I went to see a friend, a farmer's wife, and we drove over the harvest fields to take some refreshment to her husband who was working with his men. When I was going away she gave me 2 very beautiful Marichal Neil roses. I had always had a passionate love of flowers, but the scent of these and their exquisite form and color appealed to me with quite exceptional force and vividness. I left my friend and was walking slowly homeward, enjoying the calm beauty of the evening, when I became conscious of an unutterable stillness, and simultaneously every object about me became bathed in a soft light. Clearer and more ethereal than I had ever before seen. Then a voice whispered in my soul, God is all. He is not far away in the heaven, He is here. This grass under your feet is He, this bountiful harvest, that blue sky, those roses in your hand, you yourself are all one with Him. All is well for ever and ever, for there is no place or time where God is not. Then the earth and air and sky thrilled and vibrated to one song, and the burden of it was, Glory to God in the highest and on earth, peace, goodwill toward men. On my return home both my husband and his sister remarked a change in my face. An infinite peace and joy filled my heart, worldly ambitions and cares died in the light of the glorious truth that was revealed to me, all anxiety and trouble about the future had utterly left me, and my life is one long song of love and peace. When I wake in the night or rise from my bed in the morning, nay, at all hours of the day and night, the song is ever with me, Glory to God in the highest, on earth, peace, goodwill toward men. Now I could read Walt Whitman. Read him. Indeed, it seemed more than reading, for my soul, eagerly drinking in his words, was thereby refreshed and invigorated. The effects of this experience on my daily life have been many, chiefly, I think, after the deep underlying joy and peace came a faith in the eternal rightness of all things, a ceasing to fret and worry over the problem of evil. A desire to live in the open air as much as possible and an ever-growing delight in the beauties of nature at all times and seasons of the year. A strong tendency toward simplicity of life and deepening sense of the equality and brotherhood of all men. A. It will be noticed that the subjective light was well, though not strongly marked in the case. B. That moral elevation was a prominent feature. C. Intellectual illumination seems to have been present, though we have no conclusive evidence of it. D. The sense of immortality was pronounced. E. Fear of death was lost. F. We are not told in so many words, but it seems plain that there could be no sense of sin in the mental condition which accompanied and followed the experience. G. The change was sudden, instantaneous. H. The previous character of the person's mind would mark her as a likely person to have such an experience as this. I. She was of the right age, in her 31st year. J. The present writer cannot speak of any added charm to the personality of Mrs. E., but it seems to him we must gather from what we are told that such occurred upon her illumination. K. The phenomenon which in the great cases has been called transfiguration was present in moderate degree in this. It was noticed by both her husband and her sister. Only one thing more remains to say. What may be called the mental suspension which seems to be a necessary preliminary to illumination was noticed and reported by Mrs. E. I became conscious of an unutterable stillness, and, simultaneously, she was wrapped in the subjective light. It seems remarkable that this fact should have been noted by the old Hindu seers, and it is not surprising that it was somewhat misinterpreted by them. It seems that they thought that this mental suspension was not only an inevitable accompaniment of illumination but an efficient cause of it. They therefore laid down the strictest rules for inducing the mental condition in question in the hope and expectation that being secured, illumination would follow. So we have such directions as these: a devotee should constantly devote himself to abstraction, remaining in a secret place, alone, with his mind and self-restrained, without expectation and without belongings, 154:68. And again, that mental condition, in which the mind restrained by practice of abstraction, ceases to work, 154:69. 69. This was supposed to be the mental state out of which nirvana must arise. It is the state out of which it arises, but it does not follow and does not appear that the state of mental suspension has any causal relation to the state of illumination or nirvana. This is perhaps as good a place as any for a quotation from Gibbon, which will shed some light on the history of opinion on the above point, and will also show how a great student and great man may utterly fail to see facts, which, though brought immediately to his notice, are out of accord with his preconceptions. He says of the Emperor Cantacuzene, 93, 193, that he defended the divine light of Mount Tabor, a memorable question which consummates the religious follies of the Greeks. The fakirs of India, and the monks of the Oriental Church were alike persuaded that in total abstraction of the faculties of the mind and body the purer spirit may ascend to the enjoyment and vision of the deity. The opinion and practice of the monasteries of Mount Athos will be best represented in the words of an abbot who flourished in the 11th century. When thou art alone in thy cell, says the ascetic teacher, shut thy door, and seat thyself in a corner, raise thy mind above all things vain and transitory, recline thy beard and chin on thy breast. Turn thy eyes and thy thoughts towards the middle of thy belly, the region of the navel, and search the place of the heart, the seat of the soul. At first all will be dark and comfortless, but if you persevere day and night you will feel an ineffable joy, and no sooner has the soul discovered the place of the heart than it is involved in a mystic and ethereal light. This light, the production of a distempered fancy, the creature of an empty stomach and an empty brain, was adored by the Quietists as the pure and perfect essence of God himself. Gibbon has correctly reported the recommendations of the Indian sages. The truth of the matter seems to be as follows: when, without forethought, knowledge or endeavor, as in all the Western cases as far as the writer knows, illumination comes spontaneously. It is preceded, for an instant at least, by what we may call mental suspension. That fact having been noted by the Eastern adepts, who sought to reduce nirvana to an art, it was supposed that, mental suspension being secured, illumination would follow, that the first was, in fact, in some way, the cause of the second. Now it seems to the writer certain that where you have a subject on the verge, as it were, of the cosmic sense, it may be possible to induce this by following the directions given in, for instance, the Bhagavad Gita, when, nothing being done, illumination would not spontaneously supervene. But the cosmic sense, though in any case more valuable than all the riches of the earth, when self-induced, as by such methods as referred to, is less valuable. Probably much less valuable, less potent and masterful, less creative, than it is in cases in which it bursts forth, as it were, of its own strength, self-delivered, triumphant. It seems certain that the monks of Mount Athos really knew of the state here called cosmic consciousness, otherwise how could they have specified, as they did, the subjective light? From whence would they have derived the knowledge of it and of the ineffable joy which accompanies it? Concerning the adoration of the cosmic sense as God, perhaps it is so. XXXV Case of A. J. S. I was born on the 24th of January, 1871, in a country village, the 7th of a family of 9. I was the youngest of 6 girls. My father, mother, and all of us children were very musical, the girls having fine voices. When I was 3 or 4 years old I was taken about to different places to sing, and at that age could sing a song through if it were sung to me. When a little older one would make believe I was a great singer and would spend hours thumping on an old desk of my father's rather than play on the organ, because I would hear the sound I made on the latter, which did not always please me. While from the other there came no sound to interfere with that created in my own imagination. To this day I sometimes wonder whether I did not really hear coming from the old desk the music which my fancy created in myself. I was always very frail. Much of the time I did not care to play with other children, but liked better to listen to this spiritual music which fascinated me. In the end this dream was dissipated by the tragic death of my father, and by an accident which happened to myself. Or did I, perhaps, simply grow out of it? The thought of becoming a public singer was constantly held before me by my family and friends, and I was sent to a musical school in Boston. It appeared that my voice had all the quality supposed, but my frail physique and some results of the accident alluded to stood in my way, yet I would not give up. I was married early and afterwards worked at my music harder than ever, and my husband felt that my heart was so much in singing that it would probably kill me to give it up. Soon, however, I broke down entirely as the result of overwork. Everything possible was done for me, but to no avail. I failed steadily and was in constant pain from the effect of a fall in childhood by which my spine was injured. I took various remedies to make me sleep, but they only brought on excitement and delirium. I was sent at last to a sanatorium, took to my bed in a darkened room and refused to see any of my friends. For a time my life was despaired of, and I only rallied to plan to take my life when I should have an opportunity. At last a time came when I had given up all hope and felt there was nothing more for me to live for or to look forward to. One day while in this state I was lying quietly in my bed when a great calmness seemed to come over me. I fell asleep only to wake a few hours after to find myself in a flood of light. I was alarmed. Then I seemed to hear the words, "Peace, be still," over and over again. I cannot say it was a voice, but I heard the words plainly and distinctly just as I had heard the music coming out of the old desk in my childhood. I put my head under the pillow to shut out the sound, but heard it just the same. I lay for what seemed to me then a long time in that condition, when gradually I was again in the dark. I sat up in my bed. I would not call the nurse, as I felt she would not understand. I did not, of course, understand myself, but I felt it meant something. This same calmness came to me often, and it always came before the light. After that night my recovery was steady without the aid in any way of a physician or medicine. When the light came to me again later I asked my husband if he did not see it, but he did not. I have not tried to cultivate it, as I do not understand it. I only know that whereas formerly I was a wreck I am today well and strong physically and mentally, and whereas I loved the excitement of a public life I now love the quiet of home life and a few friends. With this calmness has come a power, as I call it, to heal others. With a touch or in some cases by catching the eye I can in many cases induce sleep. In other cases the person will say to me, "Why is it I feel so restful when I am near you?" When friends have asked me to tell them of my experience I have declined except in 1 or 2 cases. It is all so real to me, and I fear that to others it will seem foolish. But some day these things will all be explained, and I hope they may be soon. At the time I first saw the light I was 24 years old. I have seen it 3 times altogether. Now as to the intellectual and moral experiences that immediately follow the light, it is about impossible to set these forth, for words are very poor as a medium to express either the feeling or the vision that came to me at that time. I think the intellect could never give to me in worlds of study what is revealed to me during this experience and immediately following the presence of the light. To me it is beyond intellectual expression. It is seeing inwardly, and the word harmony would perhaps express part of what is seen. Humanity goes on and on almost in despair, hoping sometime to find rest and peace and fullness of life in the undefined future, when, in fact, all these and more are here now if we could, only reach out our hand and take them. My supreme desire is to be of help to humanity, but when I have had this light come to me I have been so filled with the desire to reveal what I see to mankind that it seems as though I were not doing anything at all. The mental experiences following the light are always essentially the same, namely, an intense desire to reveal man to himself and to aid those who are trying to find something worth living for in what they call this life. I do not feel that I have made myself intelligible, but I repeat that, in this subject, at least, words offer a most inadequate medium of expression. Part 6. Last words. Many readers, before they have reached this page, will have been struck by the fact that the name of no woman is included in the list of so-called great cases, and the names of only 3 in that of lesser, imperfect and doubtful instances. Besides these 3 the editor knows another woman, still living, who is undoubtedly if not a great, still a genuine, case. She would not, however, permit the editor to use her experience even without her name, and the case is therefore reluctantly entirely omitted. The only other woman known to the present writer, either in the past or in the present, who is or was, either certainly or almost certainly, a case of cosmic consciousness is Madame Guyon, who was, it seems to him, a genuine and great instance. Though unfortunately the evidence in her case is not as definite as could be wished. 2. Jean-Marie Bouvier's de la Mothe was born April 13, 1648, was a sickly and precocious child, with strong religious tendencies, great earnestness of purpose, a leaning towards self-renunciation and a passion for spiritual books. Especially the Bible, which as a child of 10 she used to read from morning till night. At the age of 16 she was married to M. Guyon, who was then 38. What with an elderly and stern husband and a most disagreeable mother-in-law, her objective life was unhappy, even miserable. For all outward ills she found consolation in religion, and her life was really a happy one, except when this inward joy suffered eclipse, as from time to time it did. At last, however, the 22d of July, 1680, that is, in the summer of her 33rd year, came final deliverance. The writer does not know of any record of her subjective experience upon that day, but it seems certain that the rest of her life was filled with peace and happiness, which is characteristic of the lives of those who have passed into cosmic consciousness. She describes herself 319 as having ceased from all self-originated action and choice. To her amazement and unspeakable happiness, it appeared as though all such natural movement existed no longer, a higher power had displaced and occupied its room. I even perceived no more, she writes in her autobiography, the soul which he had formerly conducted by his rod and his staff, because now he alone appeared to me, my soul having given up its place to him. Even as a little drop of water cast into the sea receives the qualities of the sea. She speaks of herself as now practicing the virtues no longer as virtues, that is, not by separate and constrained efforts. It would have required effort not to practice them. 180, 227. 3. Some years ago, when the design of this volume was forming in the mind of the writer, it was his intention to include several chapters treating of other departures from the norm in the mental life of man more or less analogous to that which he has named cosmic consciousness, for the special purpose of examining into the relation, if any, between these and the latter. Had he persisted in his plan he would have included, 1. A review of hypnotism, 2. Of so-called miracles, supernormal physical, as distinguished from supernormal mental powers. 3. So-called spiritualism, the notion of the sensible communion of man with other and perhaps higher spirits considered in relation to this other notion of the communion of man with a higher self within himself. And, 4. Cases in which man seems to be the center and in some sense the director of forces presumably existing entirely outside of himself. And the relation of such cases, if any, to the preterhuman psychic manifestations of those endowed with the cosmic sense. Time, and probably the necessary ability, failed him for the larger attempt. And he will only allude to one case, belonging to category 4, for the sake of indicating what seems to him the strong probability that all these different classes of cases, wherever genuine, as many of them 320 undoubtedly are, if they do not always lie side by side, at least touch one another by their angles. 4. William Stainton Moses, 131:245 Eid Sikh, was born in Lincolnshire, England, November 5, 1839. His father was headmaster of a grammar school. William Stainton Moses was educated at Oxford. Took his degree. Was ordained, and was for the rest of his life, as long as health permitted, an active and popular parish clergyman. Up to the age of 33 he differed in no special respect from the ordinary university-educated English church clergyman. At that period, about the usual time of life, it will be noted, for the oncoming of cosmic consciousness, in the course of 1872, the physical phenomena, which give him interest to us here, began. They continued for some 10 years and then, with failing health, passed away. William Stainton Moses died in September, 1892. He never married, and went little into society. His personal appearance offered no indication of his peculiar gift. He was of middle stature, strongly made, with somewhat heavy features and thick dark hair and beard, 131, 250. It must be understood that the facts as given in this case, as well as the trustworthiness of those who have reported them, including, of course, William Stainton Moses himself, have been very thoroughly inquired into by such competent men as T.W. H. Myers, and it is firmly believed that no deception of any kind has been attempted or thought of. Whatever explanation of them may ultimately be given and accepted, the facts as set down today will almost certainly stand. It would be impossible in this place to give the data upon which the truth of the account rests. These can be found elsewhere by those who wish to see them. All that is necessary here and all that can be done is to cite as samples a very few instances of the supernormal occurrences which, with extraordinary frequency, and in great variety, surrounded the man for at least 10 years. Motion without contact, directed by evident intelligence, is seen markedly in the following instance. I was calling on a friend, and the conversation fell on the phenomena of spiritualism. A sitting was proposed, and nothing, or almost nothing, occurred. We were quite alone in the room, which was well lighted. We drew back from the table, intending to give up the attempt. My friend asked why nothing occurred. The table, untouched by us, rose and gently touched my throat and chest 3 times. I was suffering from severe bronchial symptoms, and was altogether below par. After this no rap or movement could be elicited, and we were fain to accept the explanation of our want of success. My first personal experience of levitation was about 5 months after my introduction to spiritualism. Physical phenomena of a very powerful description had been developed with great rapidity. We were new to the subject, and the phenomena were most interesting. After much movement of objects, and lifting and tilting of the table, a small hand organ, a child's plaything, was floated about the room, making a most inharmonious din. It was a favorite amusement with the little, Puck-like invisible who then manifested. One day, August 30th, 1872, the little organ was violently thrown down in a distant corner of the room, and I felt my chair drawn back from the table and turned into the corner near which I sat. It was so placed that my face was turned away from the circle to the angle made by the 2 walls. In this position the chair was raised from the floor to a distance of, I should judge, 12 or 14 inches. My feet touched the top of the skirting board, which would be about 12 inches in height. The chair remained suspended for a few moments, and I then felt myself going from it, higher and higher, with a very slow and easy movement. I had no sense of discomfort nor of apprehension. I was perfectly conscious of what was being done, and described the process to those who were sitting at the table. The movement was very steady and occupied what seemed a long time before it was completed. I was close to the wall, so close that I was able to put a pencil firmly against my chest and to mark the spot opposite to me on the wall paper. That mark, when measured afterwards, was found to be rather more than 6 feet from the floor, and, from its position, it was clear that my head must have been in the very corner of the room, close to the ceiling. I do not think that I was in any way entranced. I was perfectly clear in my mind, quite alive to what was being done, and fully conscious of the curious phenomenon. I felt no pressure on any part of my body, only a sensation of being in a lift, whilst objects seemed to be passing away from below me. I remember a slight difficulty in breathing and a sensation of fullness in the chest, with a general feeling of being lighter than the atmosphere. I was lowered down quite gently and placed in the chair, which had settled in its old position. The measurements and observation were taken immediately and the marks which I had made with my pencil were noted. My voice was said at the time to sound as if from the corner of the room, close to the ceiling. This experiment was more or less successfully repeated on 9 other occasions. On the 2d of September, 1872, I see from my records that I was 3 times raised on to the table and twice levitated in the corner of the room. The first movement onto the table was very sudden, a sort of instantaneous jerk. I was conscious of nothing until I found myself on the table, my chair being unmoved. This, under ordinary circumstances, is what we call impossible. I was so placed that it would have been out of my power to quit my place at the table without moving my chair. In the second attempt I was placed on the table in a standing posture. In this case I was conscious of the withdrawal of my chair and of being raised to the level of the table and then of being impelled forward so as to stand upon it. I was not entranced, nor was I conscious of any external pressure. In the third case I was thrown onto the table, and from that position on to an adjacent sofa. The movement was instantaneous, as in the first recorded case. And though I was thrown to a considerable distance, and with considerable force, I was in no way hurt. At the time I lay on the sofa I felt the chair in which I had been sitting and which would be 4 feet from where I lay, come and press my back several times. I was finally placed on the table. For an enormous number of similar and diverse phenomena occurring in this case, see 131. v. As already stated, the above are only quoted as samples of unusual supernormal incidents said to have taken place, which undoubtedly did take place over and over again for 10 years in the experience of this man. Now what, if any, relation exists between this case and one of cosmic consciousness? We have seen that in the case of William Stainton Moses the phenomena with which we are dealing began at about the typical age, 33 years, and it is stated that on at least one occasion, the drain on the vital strength of William Stainton Moses was so great that the manifestations had to be discontinued. It seems clear from the matter-of-course way the above is stated that the medium habitually felt fatigue or exhaustion in proportion to the frequency and magnitude of the manifestations. We have also seen that sickness on the part of the medium, in like manner interfered with the production of the phenomena. These facts point to the medium himself as the source of the force exhibited in so many different ways. If this inference is correct, it is at the same time undoubtedly true that he was not aware that the power which caused the phenomena proceeded from himself. Neither should we expect, reasoning from analogy, that he would be. Since even in cosmic consciousness, where all the phenomena are mental and where consequently we should look that the real actor would be still less liable to be deceived as to the person acting, we see that he is so, not occasionally, but almost or quite constantly. Paul, Muhammad, Yepes, Bayman, Blake, tell us over and over again that the great thoughts, divine emotions, which they express, are not their own but communicated from without. The protestations made by Blake, 100 times repeated, and the last time to his wife a few minutes before his death, in reference to the songs which he sang as he lay slowly dying, "My beloved, they are not mine. No, they are not mine," have been, in one shape or another, made by them all. Still we believe today that that other self which wrote the epistles, dictated the Quran, composed the Aurora, was really none other than a part, the more divine part, of Paul, Muhammad and Bayman respectively. The man acts and does not know that it is he who is acting, is sure, in fact, that it is not. Scouts, as does Muhammad, indignantly the imputation that the thoughts, the words, proceed from him. And offers proof that such imputation neither is nor can be founded on fact, and if ye are in doubt of what we have revealed unto our servant, Gabriel speaks, and our servant is, of course, Muhammad, then bring a chapter like it. But if ye do not, and ye shall surely do it not, etc., 151:13. In many cases the denial has been accepted and the world has agreed with the enunciator that directly, or indirectly, God has revealed to him the exalted sentiments and sublime truths that have passed his lips, that God, or a messenger from God, lives in him and speaks through him. Why not suppose that we have involved in the personality of William Stainton Moses a parallel fact, a parallel duplex or multiplex personality, that in some way, so far, perhaps, utterly inconceivable to us, as to some of their contemporaries and followers it was inconceivable that Jesus and Muhammad merely as men said and did the words and deeds which proceeded from them, as well as to himself. William Stainton Moses did himself evolve the force, did himself furnish the intelligence, which were operative in the phenomena. It seems corroborative of this view that bodies, as 100-ton rocks or houses, such as no man could move, are not lifted or displaced. That the lights are not greater than could be supplied by the force resident in ordinary man, supposing that force or some of it to take the form of light. That the intelligence manifested, though often considerable and sometimes extraordinary, is not above human possibilities, taking into account the intelligence possessed by persons having cosmic consciousness. For if supramortal beings were operative in the production of these so-called spiritualistic phenomena, why should these remain so constantly upon or, taking into account only the ordinary human faculties, immediately above the plane of human powers? Then again we have seen in the course of this study that the whole history of man, as well as that of the organic world, is simply the history of the evolution of new faculties one after the other, any one of which, before it was evolved, would have seemed an impossibility and an absurdity to any member of the race about to take it on. Have we not in, for instance, spiritualism and telepathy, with all their almost infinitely varied phenomena, the germ or germs of some new faculty or faculties, so far as little understood as was cosmic consciousness 1,000 years ago, and not, as sometimes thought, in any sense, the action or interference in human affairs either of disembodied spirits or of infra- or extra-human minds? Such faculties not necessarily destined to expand and become universal, for, in evolution many are called but few chosen, but almost certainly, in modern times, and down to date, expanding and becoming more common. And, indeed, may it not well be that in the self-conscious human being, as we know him today, we have the psychic germ of not one higher race only, but of several? As in the nebula of a solar system we have the potentiality not of one sphere only or one kind of sphere, but of a sun, planets, moons, comets and many lesser bodies. As in the first, unicellular, living creature we had the parent not of one only but of many races of multicellular descendants. As in the alleless Homo we had the progenitor, not merely of one race, but of many races of variously charactered self-conscious men, so it may be, may it not, that in the foremost race or races of self-conscious man today we have the eligibility, the germ, of not one superior race only, but of several. As for example, a cosmic conscious race. Another race that shall possess seemingly miraculous powers of acting upon what we call objective nature, another with clairvoyant powers far surpassing those possessed by the best specimens so far, another with miraculous healing powers, and so on. That so-called miraculous powers are closely allied to what is here called cosmic consciousness, that they appear in relation with the latter, that they are no more supernatural than it is, and that these powers, in their natures, cover a large range of operation. All this is clearly recognized and plainly taught by the men who, of all others, know most on the subject. Gautama's dicta thereon may be read, supra, in the chapter devoted to him. Paul is no less explicit, but sets forth in very plain terms, that there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit, 2012, 1, that, to one is given through the Spirit the word of wisdom, to another the word of knowledge, to another faith, to another gifts of healing, to another miraculous powers, to another discernings of spirits, and to another interpretation of tongues, 2012, 8-10. 6. A main object which the writer of this volume has had before him has been to point out that there have lived in this world certain men who in consequence, not of an extraordinary development of any or all of the ordinary mental faculties, but by the possession of a new one peculiar to themselves and non-existent, or at least undeclared, in ordinary people, see, know and feel spiritual facts and experience psychical phenomena, which being veiled from, are still of most vital import to the world at large. That if one or two of these men are studied to the exclusion of the rest, as has been the practice with not Christians only but with Buddhists and Mohammedans as well, the result must be inadequate and unsatisfactory as compared with the study of all. For the reason that none of them have been able to tell much of what they have seen, known and felt, and one or two only of them being read, what little they do tell is certain, just because of its incomplete, fragmentary character, to be misunderstood. While if they are all read and compared the testimony of each is found to throw light upon, supplement and strengthen that of all the others. That it is of the greatest importance, as has indeed always been felt, that these men should be as profoundly as possible studied and absorbed by every one who has aspirations for the higher spiritual life because the contact of the mind of the Student with the minds of these men has the effect of producing in the mind of the former all the spiritual expansion and growth of which it is by its congenital constitution capable. Through the aid of these men even cosmic consciousness itself is often possible of achievement where without them it would certainly not occur. As one of them says, I bestow upon any man or woman the entrance to all the gifts of the universe, 193, 216. Or as says another great man, who, though not, it is believed, in the class here treated of, had at least their earnestness if not their vision and their joy, at least it is with heroes and God-inspired men that I, for my part, would far rather converse, in what dialect soever they speak. Great, ever fruitful, profitable for reproof, for encouragement, for building up in manful purposes and works, are the words of those that in their day were men, 64:75. And not only is it better to study a number of these men rather than only one or two, but should the student, from idiosyncrasy, or any cause, confine his attention to one or two of them, it is immensely important that he should have an opportunity of choosing the master whom he is to follow, since a man born in Europe or America may be more certainly wrought upon, and more deeply influenced for good, by the Upanishads and Suttas than by, for instance, the New Testament. This was true, at least, of Schopenhauer and Thoreau. Of the former, it is told, in a corner of his room was placed a gilt statuette of Buddha, and on a table not far off lay Duperron's Latin translation of the Upanishads, called the Alpnicat, which served as the prayer book from which Schopenhauer read his devotions, 87, 456. Of the Alpnicat Schopenhauer said, it has been my comfort in life, it will be the solace of my death, 147:61. And as there are many men in the West who are, or would be if they read them, more benefited by Buddhistic and Mohammedan scriptures than they are by Jewish or Christian, so, doubtless, there are thousands of men in southern Asia who, born Buddhists, Brahmins or Mohammedans, would be, from some peculiarity of mental constitution, more readily and profoundly stirred by the Gospels and Pauline epistles, or leaves of grass, than by the Vedas or by any of the books that owe their inspiration to the teachings of Gautama or Muhammad. 7. If there is such a vast interval between the man with cosmic consciousness and him with self-consciousness only, how is it that the former does not stand out before the world as belonging to a separate class from the latter? How is it that there are 100 painters and poets who, in the estimation of nearly the whole world, overrank William Blake, though he had cosmic consciousness and they had it not? How is it that men, standing on almost the loftiest peaks of fame, Aristotle, Plato, Newton, Caesar, have self-consciousness only, while John Yepes, Las Casas, Edward Carpenter and others, who are said to have this supreme, all-sufficient faculty, are not generally known to have been very extraordinary men? The answer seems to be, in the first place the literary instinct, or expression of any kind, is not necessarily highly developed in the cosmic conscious mind, but is a faculty apart. Balzac worked himself to death endeavoring to acquire an adequate style, and Whitman lived and died vividly conscious of his defects of expression. Again, the average self-conscious man can appreciate the faculties of the self-conscious mind, even when unusually developed, very much easier, very much more certainly, than he can those of the cosmic conscious mind. In spite of these obvious facts, it remains true that self-conscious man, even in his blindness, has placed the highest crowns of all upon the heads of men, Gautama, Jesus, Muhammad, Dante, Shakespeare, who have had the divine faculty of cosmic consciousness. The intellect of these cosmic conscious men has often, if not always, a range and incisiveness, witness especially Dante and Shakespeare, which place them clearly above almost any merely self-conscious person. It is also clear that their purely moral qualities, witness especially Gautama, Jesus and Whitman, give them a rank apart from their self-conscious fellows, but this is not by any means the whole story. The central point, the kernel of the matter, consists in the fact that they possess qualities for which we at present have no names or concepts. Jesus alluded to one of these when he said, "Whoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall become in him a well of water springing up unto eternal life." 17:4:14. And Whitman points in the same direction when he declares that his book is not linked with the rest nor felt by the intellect, but has to do with untold latencies, 193, 17, in writer and reader. And also when he states that he does not give lectures and charity, that is, either intellectual or moral gifts, but that when he gives himself, 193, 66. The ordinary self-conscious mind cannot clearly realize the faculty alluded to in these words, and consequently it cannot give it a name. Perhaps the best that can be done is to consider it as analogous to an influx of vitality, admitted into humanity through certain men, permeating and vivifying each and all who permit it to pass into them. To the most the quality in question will seem indefinite and elusive to the last degree. As a matter of fact, it is the most important and the most solid entity that exists today in the world. 8. What is it that determines that a given man shall enter into cosmic consciousness? For this volume is physiological as well as psychological, and its psychology must tally physiological facts. In other words, what are the factors that enter into and finally decide for illumination? A. The first seems to be full maturity, the age of 30 to 40 years, according as the man is endowed at birth with greater or less longevity, that is, according to the number of years the man needs to reach full maturity, an average age of, say, 35 years. This element could have been predicated a priori, since, if mankind is growing up to cosmic consciousness, the individuals who reach the high water mark of mental evolution on the next plane below, that of self-consciousness, must be those who will first enter it. And the earliest individuals to enter it must do so when they are at their highest point of spiritual efficiency. B. Education, so called, seems to have nothing to do with it. Some of the greatest cases, Jesus, Muhammad, Yepes, Bayman and Whitman, have been, from the point of view of the schools, some of them entirely, others almost totally, ignorant. On the other hand, scholastic training does not seem necessarily to have any prejudicial influence, since some cases, as Dante, Bacon and Carpenter, were distinguished students at good colleges. But if education, in the ordinary sense of that word, has little to do with the matter, there is another sense in which it has a great deal to do with it. We are told, for instance, by a high authority, that those who desire the companionship of the cosmic sense, need the best blood, thews, endurance, that none may come to the trial till he or she brings courage and health. That only those may come who come in sweet and determined bodies, that no diseased person, no rum drinker or venereal taint is permitted to enter, 193, 125. C. It is probably imperative that the man should have a great mother, a woman strong, athletic, spiritual, of good physique, of superior mental and especially moral, powers. Unfortunately we know little or nothing of the mothers of most of our cosmic conscious cases. Bacon's, however, and certainly Whitman's, were exceptional women. Probably we should be safe in believing the traditions to the same effect of the mothers of Gautama and Jesus. D. It is most likely also necessary that the father should be a superior man physically and spiritually, though it is certainly not that he should be intellectually. E. Perhaps the most important point of all, granted a good average, or above the average, man and woman for father and mother, is that these should have opposite, or at least diverse temperaments. The secret of success or failure in all marriages is perhaps involved in the fulfillment or violation of this unwritten law. That if the fathers, for instance, should be choleric-melancholic, the mothers should be sanguine-phlegmatic, and so on. F. Then comes the final and supreme physiological necessity, namely, that the union of father and mother from which is to proceed the cosmic conscious man shall occur under perfect conditions. So that each parent shall be fully represented in the offspring, each blended with the other, the result being a perfect man with the qualities and temperaments of both father and mother, 103, 65. It is perhaps not imperative that a man should have all four temperaments as a condition of illumination, but it is probable that all the great cases have had all four, or at least three. G. The right physical and mental organization granted and full maturity having been reached, the next precondition of illumination is the time of year. Of the total of 43 cases given in this volume, in every case but 3 where the season is known, that is in 17 cases, it took place in the first 7 months of the year. The explanation of the fact that illumination occurs generally in spring and early summer is no doubt the same as that of the age at which it happens, full maturity. As at present even the foremost members of the race cannot reach the vantage ground, the status, from which cosmic consciousness can be entered before full or nearly full maturity. So the further advantage of the time of year of fullest vitality is an element of great importance. The season of the ascending sun, of increasing temperature, of rising sap and bursting bud, of the pairing of birds, at which the heart of all nature, including human nature, is at flood tide, is the season in which we might, if ever, expect. And is the season in which we find, the blossoming forth of this divine event, an event supreme in the life of the individual and to be supreme in the life of the race. Last of all, the man fitted by heredity, personal growth and the rest to receive the exalted endowment of which there is here question, must himself do something. Must place himself, perhaps not intentionally or consciously, in the right mental attitude. What this is has been pointed out already many times, both indirectly and directly, and may be once again indicated in the words of an undoubtedly inspired writer. It is the deity or cosmic sense that speaks. 154, 129, once more listen to my excellent words, most mysterious of all. Strongly I like you, therefore I will declare what is for your welfare. On me place your mind, devote yourself to me, reverence me. I declare to you truly you are dear to me. Forsaking all else, come to me as your sole refuge. I will release you from all sin, from all doubt. 9. If this volume did not threaten to become unduly large, a section or chapter of some length might very properly be devoted to the various artificial means adopted, especially in India, to induce the faculty or condition here treated of. Some of these have been alluded to, and those curious on the subject may consult especially 56 and 154. It does not seem, so far as known to the writer, that any great work has ever been done by persons in whom the faculty was artificially excited, though doubtless the lives of such persons have been made immensely happier and better. The object of the present paragraph, however, is to refer very briefly to a mental condition occasionally induced by anesthetics, which is undoubtedly closely allied to the faculty under consideration. Just as the drinking of alcohol induces a kind of artificial and bastard joy, so the inhalation of ether and chloroform induces, sometimes, a kind of artificial and bastard cosmic consciousness. The following brief cases will make this clear. 121, 586, Dr. George Wilde says, upon taking chloroform, I suddenly experienced the extraordinary impression that my spiritual being stood visibly outside my body, regarding that deserted body lying on the bed. Shortly afterward I called on 3 different professional chloroformists and asked them if any of their subjects had ever experienced sensations like my own. In reply one gentleman said, I have often heard patients express similar ideas. Another said, I myself have experienced on 3 occasions when under chloroform, exactly similar sensations. And the third gentleman said, my patients have often said that they experienced no pain, but felt as if they saw with their inner eye all I was doing during the operations. I was told of a patient who said, after anesthesis, I thought I had got at the bottom of the secrets of nature. And the dentist told me that many of his patients had experienced similar sensations to those I described. The late John Addington Symonds described his sensations, while under the influence of chloroform, thus, I seemed at first in a state of utter blankness. Then came flashes of intense light, alternating with blankness and with a keen vision of what was going on in the room round me, but no sensation of touch. I thought that I was near death, when suddenly my soul became aware of God, who was manifestly dealing with me, handling me, so to speak, in an intense personal present reality. I felt him streaming in like light upon me and heard him saying in no language, but as hands touch hands and communicate sensations, I led thee, I guided thee, you will never sin and weep and wail in madness any more, for now you have seen me. My whole consciousness seemed brought into one point of absolute conviction, the independence of my mind from my body was proved by the phenomena of this acute sensibility to spiritual facts, this utter deadness of the senses. Life and death seemed mere names. Simons adds, I cannot describe the ecstasy I felt, and, referring to his experience and its psychological evidence, says, if this had happened to a man in an uncritical age, would it not have carried conviction, like that of Saul of Tarsus, to his soul? It is curious that Simons, who seems to have really passed into a sort of actual cosmic consciousness for the moment, should have instinctively selected a genuine case to which to compare his own temporary mental state. All conditions allowed and the fact of cosmic consciousness being granted, what is its place as a psychical entity? And from where does it come? The clue to the answers, the writer thinks, may be picked up in chapters 3 and 4 of 134. It is ably shown there how the simple conscious, circumstances being favorable, passes by slow growth into the self-conscious mind. By experience, by inheritance, by accumulation and by a process of psychical masonry, percepts are collected, stored up, and of them are built recepts. Then percepts and recepts are used, as are stones and mortar in a wall, and of them are at last formed concepts. And, as the last touch is given, the completed edifice suddenly flashes into sight as a new entity and the self-conscious man has appeared upon the earth. So, it seems, are concepts, emotions, sense perceptions, all the spiritual elements of the thinking, feeling, knowing man, individually and collectively builded up until the walls, buttresses, pinnacles and towers of a still higher consciousness are finished. The moment of completion comes, the signal is given, the scaffolding falls and instantly the new structure stands revealed. X. The explanation of what may be called the mystery of religion as it exists among us today may be stated simply as follows: all men, so far, with the exception of at most a few hundreds, have lived in the world of self-consciousness without the power to leave it. The great religious seers, revealers, teachers, have also lived in that world, but at the same time in another, the world of cosmic consciousness, the latter being by far the larger, the most important and the most interesting. Whether either of these worlds has an objective existence is a matter of no consequence. They are equally real and momentous to us on either hypothesis. The men who have lived in the cosmic conscious world, that is, in the world made visible by the cosmic sense, as the forests and the sky are made visible by the sense of sight, have desired, for the comfort and good of their fellows, to tell mankind at large what they saw there. But as they were obliged, for want of a better, to use the language of self-consciousness, their accounts have been exceedingly incomplete and the words and phrases used have been so inadequate as to have been to the last degree misleading. Not only so, but, supposing a clear report, an impossibility, it would be beyond the power of the self-conscious mind to conceive the cosmic conscious world. This being so, the reports made by these spiritual travelers have been not only not understood but misunderstood in an infinite variety of senses, and the essentially similar account given by, for example, Paul, Muhammad, Dante, Jesus, Gautama, Whitman and others, has been looked upon as a variety of accounts, not of the same, but of diverse things. And these accounts, all but one, that one under the influence of which the hearer is born, have been supposed to rest solely upon the imagination of the narrator. A critical study of all these, seeming, diverse accounts will show that they are all more or less unsuccessful attempts to describe the same thing. But because it was out of the power of the original reporter, the seer, to give anything like a full and clear account of what he saw, largely because of the inadequacy of the language belonging to the self-conscious mind. Because his reporters again, as in the cases of Jesus and Gautama, who did not write, possessing only self-consciousness, blurred still further the picture. Because translators, possessing only self-consciousness and understanding very imperfectly what the teacher wished to convey, still further distorted the record. For all these reasons the important fact of the unity of the teachings of these men has been very generally overlooked, hence the confusion and the so-called mystery. A misunderstanding unavoidable, no doubt, under the circumstances, but which will one day, assuredly, be cleared up. Already many others besides the present writer have noticed the essential unity of the seeming diverse teachings in question, as, for instance, Hartmann, 100:6. Who tells us, I have carefully compared the doctrines of Bayman with those of the Eastern sages as laid down in the Secret Doctrine and in the religious literature of the East. And I find the most remarkable harmony between them in their esoteric meaning. In fact, the religion of Buddha, Krishna and the Christ seem to me to be one and identical. It is worth nothing that Hartmann's specimen teachers are all cases of cosmic consciousness, although of course he knew nothing of that as a specific mental status. 11. One word in conclusion. The writer of this book, since it was first conceived some few years ago, has sought diligently for cases of cosmic consciousness, and his whole list, so far, including some imperfect and doubtful cases, totals up nearly 50. Several of these are contemporary, minor cases, such as may have occurred in considerable numbers in any of the recent centuries and no records of them remain. He has, however, as more than once stated, found 13, all of them so great that they must, almost inevitably, live. As has been already shown, 5 of these men lived during the 18 centuries which elapsed between the birth of Gautama and that of Dante, and the other 8 in the 600 years between the birth of Dante and today. This would mean that cases of cosmic consciousness are nearly 5 times as frequent now as they were, say, 1,000 years ago. It is not, of course, pretended that they are becoming more frequent in exactly this ratio. There must have occurred a large number of cases in the last 2,500 years, all memory of which is lost. No man could say positively how many lived in any given epoch. But it seems tolerably certain that these men are more numerous in the modern than they were in the ancient world, and this fact, taken in connection with the general theory of psychic evolution, fully considered on previous pages, goes far to confirm the conclusion that just as, long ago, self-consciousness appeared in the best specimens of our ancestral race in the prime of life, and gradually became more and more universal and appeared in the individual at an earlier and earlier age, until, as we see now, it has become almost universal and appears at the average of about 3 years, so will cosmic consciousness become more and more universal and appear earlier in the individual life until the race at large will possess this faculty. The same race and not the same, for a cosmic conscious race will not be the race which exists today, any more than the present race of men is the same race which existed prior to the evolution of self-consciousness. The simple truth is, that there has lived on the earth, appearing at intervals, for thousands of years among ordinary men, the first faint beginnings of another race. Walking the earth and breathing the air with us, but at the same time walking another earth and breathing another air of which we know little or nothing, but which is, all the same, our spiritual life, as its absence would be our spiritual death. This new race is an act of being born from us, and in the near future it will occupy and possess the earth. The end.